This is the BBC, where we join Jane Hill now for a news special.
Hello and welcome to viewers in the UK and around the world to this special BBC News coverage from Windsor Castle following the death of the Duke of Edinburgh at the age of 99. Gun salutes will take place across the UK today to mark an extraordinary life of duty and service. Prince Philip was by the Queen's side for more than 70 years. The royal family is mourning the loss of a beloved husband and father.
If you were having problems, you could always go to him and know that he would listen and try to help.
I think he'd probably want to be remembered as, as an individual in his own right, really.
Details about the Duke's funeral are expected to be released later today as tributes are paid here in Windsor, across the country and around the Commonwealth and the world.
Flags are flying across the UK at half-mast, including here at Buckingham Palace, where a small number of people have begun to gather and lay flowers to pay tribute to Prince Philip.
We'll be reflecting on the Duke's far-reaching legacy and hearing from those whose lives he touched. Hello and welcome to this BBC News special. I'm Jane Hill at Windsor Castle, and the armed forces will lead a day of tributes today to the Duke of Edinburgh, who died yesterday at the age of 99. We will see gun salutes across the UK, in Gibraltar and from warships at sea. Details of the Duke's funeral are also expected to be announced a little later on today. Prince Philip was, of course, the longest-serving royal consort in British history, and he was a constant support to the Queen during more than 70 years of marriage. Throughout the day here today, I'll be looking back at his life with people who knew the Duke well, people whose lives were touched by his charitable work and his public duties. And we'll be discussing how his legacy will live on. And already here this morning at Windsor Castle, members of the public have been arriving to pay their respects, to sit quietly at the walls of the castle and to bring flowers. Our first report this hour is from our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
The Duke's death will be a grievous loss for the Queen after their 73 years of marriage. Last night on a BBC programme, their eldest children paid tribute to him.
I think he'd probably want to be remembered as, as an individual in his own right, really.
His appreciation of how he could help the Queen always seemed to be present in terms of supporting her, because she was very young when she became Queen, and it needed to be, I think, a double act for a lot of that time in order to allow her to take on that role.
It was in August 2017 on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace that the Duke carried out his final solo engagement, inspecting a parade by the Royal Marines. It was pouring with rain, yet the Duke, who was then 96, was not to be deterred. Duty came first that day, as it had for so many decades, so often alongside the Queen, but also pursuing his own public programme, to which he brought his own famously forthright style. But the public image of the Duke walking a few paces behind his wife only tells part of the story. His greatest contribution was the unseen support he gave to the Queen as she coped with the often solitary role of head of state. Occasionally, she alluded to it. "He is my constant strength and guide," she said during the Diamond Jubilee. He was the one person she could always turn to. Just before his 90th birthday, the Duke had said in a BBC interview that he felt it was time to wind down.
I reckon I've done my bit. I want to enjoy myself for a bit now. With less responsibility, less frantic rushing about, less preparation, less trying to think of something to say.
Yet it wasn't until 6 years later and that parade in the pouring rain on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace that there was any real evidence that he was retiring. Now the Queen must continue without him. The world will pay its tributes to a man of strong personality who made a significant contribution to the nation's life. And his family will mourn a much-loved father, grandfather, great-grandfather and husband. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
And our royal correspondent Sarah Campbell is with me here at Windsor Castle. And Sarah, of course, the public have been asked not to congregate, not to bring flowers for obvious COVID reasons, but there are scores of people here at Windsor Castle this morning, and people have been leaving flowers, and I know you've been looking at some of the messages.
No, that's right. I think that people have said to me that they just felt that they had to, and the message has gone out, from the royal family, from the government, asking people, because of the pandemic, to not do anything which would require kind of crowds to gather together. So they're asking people actually to give donations rather than flowers. But I think there's quite a strong feeling. I think perhaps particularly here as well in Windsor, because people in Windsor kind of feel that the Queen and Prince Philip were sort of local residents, and so that there's almost a personal connection. They will have seen them out and about. They'll have seen them out and about in Windsor Great Park over the years. So it's perhaps understandable why that they would feel that they would want to lay flowers. And actually, lots were laid yesterday. There was a big pile outside the other gate around the other side in Windsor Great Park, right at the end of the Long Walk. They were all cleared up last night. They were taken inside the grounds of Windsor Castle and laid out, and the messages were laid out so that members of the royal family could see the messages that have been left. And I popped up again earlier this morning, and yes, there are some more flowers that are building up there. And some of the messages are one that struck me was, it just said, extraordinary man, extraordinary life, national hero, nothing more needs to be said. I should say at this point, obviously, we're talking about the fact that COVID restrictions, that people are being asked not to go to royal residences, so Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, other buildings. But there is an online book of condolence that's on the royal website, and that is where people are being asked to leave their messages, be it messages of support for the Queen, of course, or messages of thanks, which is the messages I've seen a lot of is just thank you to the Duke for 70 years of public service. So there are ways to mark it without physically having to go to a building.
Yes, and there are many ways for members of the public to remember him. And of course, later on today, we will have the more formal side of that, one of the more formal side of that, with a lengthy gun salute.
With a lengthy gun salute, exactly. So just to give you some details, that's due to happen at midday today. It is a death gun salute. It's 41 rounds, so one every minute for 40 minutes. And they will be fired from cities across the UK, from Gibraltar and from warships out in the sea. And this is, gun salutes are, typical, they're traditional at sort of big royal events. But I think particularly for Prince Philip, it's particularly poignant because he does have such a strong connection to the armed forces, and they will want to mark it on a personal level. Whenever you saw him at any engagements when he was interacting with members of the armed forces, you could see the mutual respect because, of course, of his history fighting in the Second World War. And actually there was a lovely moment here a couple of hours ago when the household cavalry members were out clearly exercising the horses. They came around the corner, they lined up, they stopped, they gave a salute, they observed a 2-minute silence, and then they carried on. So I think today will be an important day for the armed forces because they will want to show how much he meant to them.
And we think later today we may hear a few more details about the funeral, which of course again will be so different. Perhaps were we not in a pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's worth saying, isn't it, that there are hundreds of thousands of families over the past year that have been affected by the pandemic and have had to change plans and maybe not remember their loved ones in the way that they would have liked to in any other year. And that is the case with Prince Philip's funeral as well. Of course, such an important figure, there will have been plans laid out for years as to how it would have been properly celebrated, and those will have to be curtailed, as we talked about, because of the COVID restrictions. I mean, there are limits to the amount of people that could be in the chapel for a start. But I think the main concern is not having any sort of funeral procession or some event which might gather crowds together, because people, whether you tell them to or not, they will want to come and show respect, and so that is what is to be avoided. So it is up to the Queen to approve those final plans. That is what she has been looking through over the last few hours and today, and we're expecting this afternoon to have those sort of exact details over what we can expect over the coming days.
All right, for now, Sarah, thank you very much. Our royal correspondent, Sarah Campbell. Let's go to London and to Buckingham Palace. Our correspondent, Sangeeta Maiska, is there. And what's happening there at the palace, Sangeeta?
Well, Jane, as you well know, Buckingham Palace is the centre of public life here in the UK. It is a place of celebration, and today it is a place of commemoration. When the news broke yesterday, we saw a steady stream of people coming through to the front of the palace gates. You can just see them over my shoulder, laying flowers. The police are very quick to move them on, and the reason is that the palace and the government, of course, are well aware that we're still in a pandemic. As Sarah was saying, the infection is endemic here, and the palace, mindful of that, is asking the public perhaps not to come here in person, but instead to choose a charity and to make a donation in the name of Prince Philip. The flowers that were left here last night have now been cleared away and taken inside the palace gates. But what did happen this morning is that some of the tributes, the personal handwritten notes that had been tied to the palace gates, remained up until about 8 o'clock. I'm going to read a couple of them to you because they very much captured the sentiment, the mood of people that have been arriving here, which is one of paying respect to Prince Philip's sense of duty, to his family and also to the country. One read, "To our unsung hero, Prince Philip, 65 years of service, 73 years of marriage to our beloved Queen. Thank you and rest in peace." Another one I thought that was particularly touching, left in a bowl of flowers, was a nod towards his service as a naval officer serving in World War II. Fair winds and following the seas. In other words, a message from one sailor to another: good luck on your next journey. It's interesting, as I've looked at the palace today, I've been concentrating on the balcony you can see in front of you. How many times have we seen Prince Philip next to Her Majesty the Queen, always by her side, always there in important moments in this country's history, most recently for world viewers. I was here with you for the UK and world coverage of the 2012 Olympic Games, when the royal family came out, very much a centrepiece of our existence here, of our culture here. And I think as the next couple of days work their way through, I think more and more the Queen will come to the forefront of our minds as we remember that she has lost not only her consort, but her husband of 73 years.
Sangeeta Maiska, for now at Buckingham Palace. Thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Commonwealth and talk to someone who met Prince Philip. The Queen, of course, is the patron of the Royal Commonwealth Society, which is a network of individuals and organisations committed to improving the lives and prospects of Commonwealth citizens around the world. And with me here at Windsor is Dr. Linda Yu, who is chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society. Linda, thanks for being with us here on BBC News. And you met Prince Philip, in fact, at one of his last public engagements, I believe. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is in 2016, the year before he stood down. So I had just joined the Royal Commonwealth Society, and I was very fortunate that he was at a couple of our events, as well as the Commonwealth Service at Westminster Abbey, which celebrates Commonwealth Day across the Commonwealth every March. So I met Prince Philip at Buckingham Palace. This is late 2016 to celebrate an environmental project, something which is close to his heart, and the Queen's as well. So it's the Queen's Commonwealth Canopy, which is the first environmental project the Queen has put her name to encourage protecting forests around the Commonwealth. And my impression of him was somebody who has been engaged in this issue since he was part of the WWF way back in the 1960s when he was president of the UK branch. And it really struck me that at these kinds of functions, with so many people around, he was so engaged in asking just really specific, personal no questions about how the project was coming, how I was working at the charity. And he did this, not just with me, but with everyone else that came along, which really stayed with me.
Yes, and so engaged and interested. And let's remember, this was a man then still into his 90s, working in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. His energy was completely inspiring, actually.
and I'm so interested in what you perhaps were able to pick up of his personality. I appreciate it's a formal event, you're both there in a formal capacity, but we've heard so much in the last 24 hours about his humour. Some people might call it something different, but that sort of slightly sparky side to his personality. And even though it was a formal event, I'm interested whether you were able to see a chink of that.
Yes, definitely think I saw a twinkle in his eye. And this is despite the fact that the other event that I was with him at, where this really came through, was actually at the Guild Hall. This is 2,000 people. So this is people from the charity sector. This is the High Commissioners, who are the ambassadors from Commonwealth countries. So just imagine the most packed room as he and the Queen were making sort of their way to the platform. He was speaking with me. He was speaking with people all around me. And you really got this sense of a sense of humor, as well as, tell me about what's happening in your nation in the Commonwealth. Now, remember, there's 54 countries, and it's a network of 2.4 billion people, which is what makes the Commonwealth really unusual. It's the people-to-people connection. And I think he really embodied that, because he was able to speak to people at so many different levels, but with that personal touch, which is actually quite hard to do, I think, when you are, speaking to so many people who just have such different backgrounds than you.
Yes, and you've been doing it for decades as well.
Yes.
And I'm interested that you touched on the environmental issues, and I was someone far younger than me said to me in the last 24 hours, they've only feel that they've learned since Prince Philip has died just how passionate he was about environmental issues, conservation, animal preservation, from a very long time ago, long before we started talking about this in common parlance. And they said, I didn't realise that he was in some ways ahead of the game on that.
Yeah, he was very much. If we think back to the WWF, he was the first UK president. This is the early 1960s. He then remained involved for several decades after that as the international president and then honorary president. So if we think back, decades of involvement. And I think the other area in which he was really quite ahead of his time is that he incorporated that into a couple of big Commonwealth projects that he was involved with. One of them is the Commonwealth Study Conference. This is probably one of his biggest legacies, which is to bring leaders from around the Commonwealth. They meet every 6 years, and he picks people from different sectors representing the environment, charities, industry, and he takes them on a tour for a couple of weeks. The next one's in Canada in 2023, where they can see environmental projects, where they can learn about leadership. And then by building that network, I think he's done something that we now see is important to preserve the environment and other issues, which is to get out into the grassroots and do something about it. And he has done that through the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, which also focuses on the outdoors, his continued involvement in, he's got about 800 charities that he's involved with, and a large number of those combine environment and community. I almost feel if we all listened more in the 60s and 70s, we would see that to make this change to protect our environment, you have to bring all the communities together to do that. And he was doing that, since the 1960s.
Yes, and a brief final thought about the Commonwealth broadly, because he and the Queen, we know that the Queen has always taken her role as head of the Commonwealth incredibly seriously, and again that takes us to them as a partnership, because that was something that they were both passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. So their last overseas visit was actually to Malta, a Commonwealth country, where she opened the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And in that speech, she paid tribute to Prince Philip. She said, I'm indebted to him in ways that, most of us probably wouldn't see. He was there with her. He's accompanied her on every single overseas visit. And she said, we all owe him a debt of gratitude for the work that he's done in the communities of the Commonwealth. And in fact, here's another factoid. he's not only accompanied the Queen on all her overseas visits, they've actually been to every single Commonwealth country except for two, Cameroon and Rwanda. So, they really, I think, value, as I say, this kind of rather unique part of the Commonwealth, which is the people-to-people connection, which is just as important as government to government. And that's where he, as, the Duke of Edinburgh, constant companion of the Queen, and what she called, in that speech, she called him her constancy, really made an impact on the Commonwealth.
So interesting to hear your reflections. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for being with us here on BBC News. Dr. Linda Yu, Chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society. The most senior officer in the Royal Navy has been paying tribute to Prince Philip. The Duke of Edinburgh was himself a veteran, having been one of the youngest first lieutenants in the Royal Navy. First Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff Admiral Tony Radakin says the Duke will be deeply missed.
His generous spirit, his delight in all aspects of the naval service, and his deep understanding of our values, standards and ethos made him such a close friend to the service for over 8 decades. And he will really be deeply missed by all of us.
Well, as we've been saying, gun salutes will take place today across the UK, in Gibraltar and from warships at sea to mark the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. Saluting batteries will fire 41 rounds at 1 round every minute from midday here in the UK. Locations across the country, including the Tower of London. There'll be salutes in Edinburgh, in Portsmouth. Let's talk more generally about the significance and history of the gun salute. I'm joined by Lieutenant Colonel Erica Bridge, who serves with the Royal Artillery and is Chief of Staff at the General Staff Centre at Sandhurst, and joins me from there. Hello to you. Thank you for your time. Tell us, for those, perhaps in layman terms if it's possible, explain a gun salute, the significance and what it means in terms of marking the passing of the Duke of Edinburgh.
Good morning, Jane. Yes, I mean, the gun salutes will be fired, as you say, across the country and from all 4 nations. And as you mentioned before, and Gibraltar as well. There are a number of saluting bases across the country. So Cardiff, Edinburgh Castle and Belfast will have salutes fired by 105 Regiment and 104 Regiment Royal Artillery. There'll be 2 gun salutes fired in London. The King Street Royal Horse Artillery will be firing for the first time from Woolwich. Normally they would be firing from Hyde Park as a royal park. But obviously with COVID and trying to keep the public safe as well, they will be firing from just outside their base. The Honourable Artillery Company will be firing from the Tower of London as well. And there are 2 naval stations at Devonport and Portsmouth who will be firing salutes. As you mentioned, a number of ships at sea, certainly including HMS Diamond and HMS Montrose. So really good for both the Royal Navy and the Army to be able to pay their tribute and respect to the Duke of Edinburgh through the format of a royal salute. This is known as a death gun salute, which is, as you mentioned, a 41 gun salute. This is a royal salute which incorporates the 21 rounds of a royal salute itself, and then 20 rounds which are fired because they are from those designated saluting stations. So it will take 40 minutes in total between the first round being fired and the 41st round at those 60-second intervals. The saluting bases will have between 3 and 6 guns, depending on where they're located, with the King Street having their entire ceremonial battery of 6 guns, which date back to the First World War, firing at Woolwich.
And in terms of your personal reflections as a member of the armed forces, of course, people are so interested to know your feelings today, losing the Queen's consort, a man whose life was steeped in the armed forces and who had an extremely impressive career in the Royal Navy as a young man himself as well.
Absolutely, and I think all of the military will feel great sadness in his passing. And I think, our ability to demonstrate our respect by firing these salutes will very much be felt by those soldiers and sailors who are taking part today. This will mean a huge amount to them. And, in a short space of time, they will have done an enormous amount of work to prepare for today, in spite of such short notice. But many of these batteries will be firing salutes throughout the year anyway. So their drills and their skills will be absolutely on the mark. But as I say, there'll have been a lot of preparation in the last few hours to get ammunition to the right places, for the guns to be prepared, and certainly for the King's Troop under command of Major Vicky Flood. There would have been a lot of activity over the past few hours in getting horses ready and getting their harness absolutely impeccable as well.
Of course, Lieutenant Colonel Erica Bridge, many thanks for your time today. Thank you very much. Well, the Household Cavalry has marked Prince Philip's death with a salute. Mounted soldiers rode through the streets of Windsor here before saluting in front of the castle. In Australia, there has been a military tribute to the Duke. A series of gun salutes there, fired 41 rounds outside Parliament House. The flag over Sydney Harbour Bridge has been lowered to half-mast, as has the one over Parliament House in the capital. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said memories of Prince Philip will be of his candour and of a unique, forceful and authentic personality. Well, Prince Philip often allowed television crews inner access to the workings of royal life. He did on a few occasions anyway, to show the public another side of his family. Let's talk to someone who is very much involved in one of those documentaries, Robert Hardman, who toured Windsor Castle with Prince Philip for a BBC series, The Queen's Castle. He is also royal commentator for the Daily Mail newspaper and a royal biographer as well, of course. Robert Hardman, hello and welcome.
Good morning, Jen.
Your thoughts here today, because I find myself thinking so much about the fact that the Queen, who's led such a life of service, wakes up this morning a widow. And it's something that so many families have been forced to confront, particularly over the last year. And I'm just interested, first of all, in your perspective on that, on a human level, as someone who has lost her strength, her stay, and a husband of very, very many decades.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. First and foremost, our thoughts are with the Queen. Theirs has been the longest royal marriage in history. I mean, we're living through the reign of one of the greats, the longest lived monarch that we've ever had. And as she herself has said, so much, in fact, everything that she's achieved, she's done thanks to having him there as well. He was the longest serving consort in history. And, I was lucky enough as a royal correspondent to go all over the world and watch some of these historic state visits. I mean, this is the most widely traveled monarch in history, the first monarch to go to places like Russia and China, behind the old Iron Curtain, all over the world. And wherever she went, he went. And often the Duke would go when the Queen couldn't go. I mean, when she was a young mother, she couldn't go, for example, didn't have the time, and she had young children. She couldn't sail around the world to open the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne. So she sent the Duke. I mean, he's the only member of the royal family to visit the tiniest outcrop of the Commonwealth of the old British Empire, Pitcairn Island. Had one royal visit, that was the Duke of Edinburgh. He's been to Antarctica. I mean, all these places, but it's always been to represent the Queen. And his whole life is, whenever you talk to his staff, they always said, rule number one, duty number one, support the Queen. So whatever he was doing was primarily in support of her. So yes, as you say, she wakes up today, she's missing this titanic figure who's just been part of her life, of the monarchy's life, and of the life of the nation and the Commonwealth. I mean, it's really nice actually today and yesterday just to see these the level of international tributes coming forth, genuine tributes from people really who have all over the world been touched by the umpteen things that the Duke was responsible for, whether it's the environment or the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, so many Commonwealth charities, the armed forces. His legacy is colossal.
And I do want to ask you, of course, about your personal reflections as someone who spent time with him, and it's so striking to hear people remembering his humour, people for reflecting on the fact that perhaps that cheekiness, the humour, perhaps didn't necessarily always come across in real life, or it came across in ways that we know and get portrayed as gaffes. But I'm interested in how you found him, in essence, working alongside him.
Well, you certainly had to have done your homework. I mean, here is someone who, to coin the phrase, did not suffer fools gladly. And, occasionally I did find myself asking what he would call a damn fool question. But with good reason. But people talk about they talk about occasionally his brusqueness or his abs or whatever. I mean, he was fundamentally a kind man. He would walk into a room, he'd go into a situation, it was a stiff, tense situation with most royal engagements are, and he wanted to break the ice, to make people relax a little, and he did that with humour. And as he himself once said, if you try and break the ice, occasionally you go through it. And from time to time that happened, but most of the time he was, people always, whenever you saw him in a room, you might be in some big royal reception, you just hear in one corner, you'd hear gales of laughter, and you thought, okay, the Duke's over there, because that was his way. And I was lucky enough to spend some time with him in the castle just behind you there, Jane. And after the fire of 1992, it was the Duke who led the restoration. I mean, it was a very difficult period for the monarchy, and this wonderful 1,000-year-old castle, to see it go up in flames was a tragedy. But he took this issue by the scruff of the neck. He led the restoration committee, and he put it back together. And in fact, you can go around a lot of parts of the castle, it's in better condition now than it was then. The estate around you there, the Great Park, he's been the longest serving ranger of the Great Park in its 1,000-year history. And all over Windsor, there are signs of the things he's done, whether it's the restoration of the deer herd you might see over down the Long Walk, that famous Long Walk. Tucked away in the estate where you won't see it is actually a vineyard, which was the Duke's idea a few years ago. He worked out that this soil might be quite good for producing grapes. And lo and behold, Windsor Castle sparkling wine is now so good that the Queen has been serving it at state banquets to world leaders. I mean, the level and the degree of the span of his interest is extraordinary. But I think it's on the global stage for those organisations like the Duke of Edinburgh's awards scheme, the World Wildlife Fund, a pioneering organisation that paved the way for so many other environmental groups to follow. That those sort of things, that's a legacy that we'll be talking about, for many, many years to come.
I had no idea that wine was produced here, and I suspect an awful lot of people watching today won't know that either, and that is extraordinary. And what's interesting is now we live in a world where if you do anything, if you're committed to anything, you're expected to shout about it, you're expected to tell the world on social media, to get recognition for it. And right at the beginning of your answer, you reflected on the causes that he was passionate about. And I'm struck by the number of people even today who've said, I didn't realise he was so interested in the environment from such an early age, or I didn't realise he was so interested in engineering. Is it fair to say then, would your assessment be that he didn't shout about those sort of passions and commitments?
Well, you put your finger on it, Jane. I mean, that was his style. I mean, he was so influential in so many ways, but always wanted to, as it were, redirect the spotlight away from himself and onto others. I mean, anyone who ever tried to sort of suggest things like, let's have a commemorative stamp for your birthday, sir, absolutely devastating. He didn't like a fuss, and that was always his way. And he was very good at bringing people together, what he called his convening power, and getting other people to think that it was their idea. So often he organised an extraordinary summit in the 80s where he got all the major faiths in the world to gather and get them to all agree to sign up to various environmental policies. It was a major achievement at the time. He even got the Pope on board. I mean, not many people could do that. But that was his way. But he'd never take the credit for it. I mean, if you go into the castle, he never really, there's nothing there to say it was the Duke of Edinburgh that led the restoration after the fire. But there's a stained glass window which shows exactly what happened, and it's a beautiful window. And he designed it himself. Nothing to say that either. Here's a man who's a very talented artist. Actually, the only way you know that he's painted any of the pictures hanging in the Royal Palace is down in the bottom right-hand corner is a tiny little heave facing forward and backwards. That's about the nearest he came to blowing his own trumpet. But we can blow his trumpet for him. He really does leave a colossal mark, and it's really nice to see that the whole world is waking up to that.
And the impact in the weeks and months to come, Robert, on the royal family as a whole. These are curious times in a pandemic, but difficult times there have been recently in recent months for the royal family. And before I let you go, I'm just interested on your thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, he's been very much the sort of in private, the head of the family. I mean, clearly the Queen is the head of everything, it's the monarch and the head of the Commonwealth and so on. But she was always very keen that within the family, the Duke was sort of the paterfamilias, the head of the family, and he was this very authoritative figure. It was a very sensitive man, someone to whom all the members of the family could turn. I think he's often seen as a sort of traditionalist and a disciplinarian. But as he's often said himself, he married into this institution. He knows what it's like to come up against some of the traditionalists and the establishment, because he did himself in the early days. So he was always there for the younger members of the family, and he was very good at sort of sorting out these, like all families. And he would say, we're a family, like all families. They would have their difficulties, but I'm quite sure that everyone will be rallying around the Queen right now and making sure that as we go forward, that everything is as can be as to provide sort of solace for her. He leaves, as I said, this legacy. But I think all the members of the family will be very keen to honour his memory properly and appropriately, and I think we're going to see a great show of royal unity in the weeks and months ahead.
Robert Hardman, thank you very much for your time. Royal biographer and documentary maker Robert Hardman joining me there. And just as I was talking to Robert, just gave me a chance to look around, and there really is a steady stream of people arriving here at Windsor Castle. A lot of people holding bouquets of flowers and certainly many scores of people arriving in a steady stream here to pay their respects in Windsor. Well, leaders from around the world, past and present, have been paying heartfelt tributes to the Duke of Edinburgh, praising his life of duty and devotion to the Queen. Those offering their condolences include the King and Queen of Spain and the US President Joe Biden, who said that the Duke's legacy will live on through all the charitable endeavours that he shaped. James Reynolds has this report.
Right from the start of the Queen's reign, Prince Philip was 2 steps behind and sometimes even out of shot. The model clearly worked. The royal couple went on to repeat it in more than 250 foreign trips. There were frequent visits to Canada, where the Queen remains head of state.
Prince Philip was a man of service, motivated by a sense of duty to others. I know that through the Duke of Edinburgh's award, he helped empower millions of young people from all backgrounds, including here in Canada, to realize their greatest potential.
The Duke was remembered in Australia, a country he visited more than 20 times.
Above all, he was a man who was steadfast, who could be relied upon, always standing by his Queen.
The Duke met a number of American presidents. In 2016, at the age of 94, he insisted on driving the Obamas from the helipad to Windsor Castle, making a small piece of history as the oldest ever presidential chauffeur.
He was a heck of a guy. It was his lifetime of service to the United Kingdom and the whole Commonwealth was visible to everybody for a long, long time. I think he's going to be missed, particularly in the United Kingdom. But 99 years old, he never slowed down at all, and which I admire the devil out of.
Prince Philip, here with King Felipe of Spain, was related to many of the royal families of Europe. His was a death in the family. Dear Aunt Lilibet, wrote Spain's King and Queen, we are deeply saddened to hear about the passing away of dear Uncle Philip. This is how the news broke in South Africa. The continent is home to Commonwealth and former Commonwealth states.
You know, our heart is being saddened by the death of the prince. But you know, the old man has lived, but it's a great loss. But we just wish the family, you know, our condolences, you know, that they may be comforted.
It is sad, yes, because we've lost a life. But then looking at the age he was, I guess it's a celebratory thing. We need to celebrate the prince's life and no need for crying.
President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe wrote, "My deepest condolences to the people of the United Kingdom and the royal family on the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip. May his soul rest in eternal peace." But it's the islanders of Tanna in the southwest Pacific who may feel the deepest loss of all. Some worship Prince Philip as the reincarnation of an ancient warrior. James Reynolds, BBC News.
And in fact, here at Windsor Castle this morning, we've been talking about so many members of the public arriving to pay their respects. A member of our team, in fact, just saw the Earl of Wessex, the Duke of Edinburgh's youngest child, of course, arriving here at Windsor Castle. We will continue to talk about the many, many tributes that are being paid. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has announced that a memorial will be held following the Prince's funeral. Let's hear from Jacinda Ardern reflecting on the Duke of Edinburgh's strong connection to New Zealand.
He visited with Her Majesty the Queen on 10 occasions and then had additional solo visits. The first was in 1953 and the last was in 2002. He had a connection to a number of New Zealand organisations, both as patrons and supporters, including, for instance, the New Zealand Defence Force. For over 50 years, the Duke of Edinburgh Awards have connected him to thousands of New Zealand young people. And of course, perhaps most importantly, he has served in support of Her Majesty the Queen for many, many years in her service to New Zealand, the Commonwealth, and indeed the world.
Jacinda Ardern speaking in New Zealand. As we've been reflecting, gun salutes will be held across the UK today, in Gibraltar and from warships at sea to mark the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. Saluting batteries will fire 41 rounds. One round every minute from midday UK time. Locations include the Tower of London, and the salute at Woolwich Barracks will feature First World War field guns that were fired at Prince Philip's wedding to the Queen in 1947. Let's talk to our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale. And Jonathan, explain the role, the significance of a 41-gun salute.
Yes, I mean, usually a 21-gun salute would be an honour for a head of state visiting the United Kingdom, but on special occasions they do fire a 41-gun salute. And part of this is the arcane sort of laws that if you're firing from a royal fortress like the Tower of London, you are allowed to fire a 41-gun salute. And of course, on special occasions like the death of Winston Churchill, death of Queen Victoria, for example, they have fired 41-gun salutes, indeed for royal births too. So what we're going to see today is at midday, as you say, first of all, the King's Troop, Royal Horse Artillery, who are confined to barracks in Woolwich, who would normally be at Hyde Park doing this salute, will, in their parade ground, start that salute, 41-gun salute, using those World War I guns that have been used, as you say, First of all, for the royal wedding, when Prince Philip married the Queen, but also in her coronation too. And then we will also see that same event happening in all corners of the globe, at the Tower of London, but also in the four corners of the UK, in Edinburgh, in Cardiff, and in Belfast. And of course, given his connections to the Royal Navy, there will also be a gun salute at the naval base in Portsmouth, and also at Devonport and in Gibraltar, and then two ships at sea. HMS Diamond, which is off the south coast, left Portsmouth yesterday with the white ensign lowered. Will do that salute out at sea. And then also in the Gulf at the moment, HMS Montrose will fire their ceremonial guns in honour of the Duke and to remember his life.
Jonathan Beale, thank you, our defence correspondent. Well, let's reflect again for a few minutes with Dr. Linda Yu, who is chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society, because, Linda, you talked so eloquently earlier on about your last meeting with the Duke of Edinburgh in one of his last public roles. And just the importance of the Commonwealth and the extent to which we know that the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh take that commitment very, very seriously.
Yeah, they absolutely do. I think if you look at the number of countries the Duke of Edinburgh has accompanied the Queen on, we're talking hundreds. And of course, he's also taken solo visits. The fact that he's been to every single Commonwealth country except for two, Cameroon and Rwanda, just, I think, signifies the importance they place on making that connection. Now, the Duke of Edinburgh accompanied the Queen to her final overseas visit, official overseas visit, I should say, which is to Malta, to open the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And that's not the only one that they've been to. They've been to the Commonwealth Games, as it's been held around the Commonwealth. In 2011, they were in Perth in Australia, also, to celebrate the Commonwealth. And I think what this is really suggesting is that the Commonwealth, in terms of the importance it's played in the charitable work of the Duke, just cannot be overstated. So about a third of his charities are actually related to the Commonwealth. And a number of his key legacies, like the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, millions of young people have been inspired to volunteer, work in the community. And that award has been granted in 41 Commonwealth countries. And in fact, one of my staff at the Royal Commonwealth Society won a Duke of Edinburgh Award. And then 2 years later, she decided when she finished uni, she was going to come work for us at the Royal Commonwealth Society. And she said to me, yeah, it changed the way she thought about how she would pursue her work. And so she said, I get an award from the Duke of Edinburgh. I decide I'm going to work in charities and be committed to the Commonwealth. And here I am 2 years later organising events in St. James's Palace for the royal family about the Commonwealth. So I think that gives a sense of the impact that he's had on young lives. And I think that is going to be one of the most powerful things that we will remember about the Duke of Edinburgh, among many things.
Oh yes, and his scheme. We're going to talk about that more later in the afternoon. But that is profound, because that has reached such a large number of people, and that's absolutely as he wanted it.
Yeah, absolutely. And another huge initiative he does, which is the Emerging Leaders Dialogue, which is within what's called the Commonwealth Study Conferences. So every 6 years, and this was actually founded in 1956 in Oxford, he brought together not just government leaders, but industry leaders, young leaders, people who are community leaders. He brought these disparate people together, about 200-300 of them, and essentially sat them down in a residential program. And it's based in different Commonwealth countries. It'll be in Canada in 2023. It's been held in Malaysia. And what they do is they go around the communities and they learn about the values that I think bind us together. And that's one of the unique things about the Commonwealth, the person-to-person connection, but it's also bound by values, the values of equality, the values of protecting the environment, the values, the shared values. And this is what he was trying to foster. And at the end of that program, which has been going on, like I said, since the 1950s, the leaders put together a plan for how they're going to make an impact on the world and in their community. So stepping outside of their jobs as business leaders or government leaders. And that's actually been taken over by Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, who's now the president of it. And that's going to be another massive legacy of just priming, I think, a very holistic view to leadership that we we all now talk about a lot, but again, he was very much ahead of his time.
Yes, that's so interesting. It's very, very interesting to hear your reflections. Thank you very much for now, Dr. Linda Yu. Thank you very much indeed. Well, among his many interests, Prince Philip had a passion for engineering. We've talked about that just a little so far today. Let's talk about it a lot more, because I'm joined by Jim McDonald, Sir Jim McDonald, I think, President of the Royal Academy of Engineering. Thank you so much for your time. And I know you met the Duke of Edinburgh quite a number of times, so do tell us about some of those experiences and how you remember him.
Thank you, Jane, and good morning. And of course, no organisation could ever have a patron that was so enthusiastic and such a wonderful supporter for engineering. And the entire Academy, or fellowship, which is made up of 1,600 of the world's best engineers, are deeply saddened. I should say that through the course of yesterday, we had many of our fellows giving us photographs and anecdotes of their wonderful time that they spent with Prince Philip at the Academy's base in London, suitably called the Prince Philip House in honour of the Duke. But the joy that they felt in his association and his leadership was terrific. We should say, of course, that I heard an earlier speaker talking about the Duke's convening authority. And we should remember in 1965, the Duke was president of the Council of Engineering Institutions. And it was his vision to establish engineering at the heart of society which really led to the creation of the Royal Academy of Engineering. So he laid out his own vision, brought together 130 of the country's best engineers at the time, including Sir Frank Whittle, the pioneer in the jet engines, Sir Overy Arup, design expert, even Sir Barnes Wallis, the inventor of the bouncing bomb, to really establish engineering at the heart of what we do. And the tendency there was to make sure engineering drove policy, drove economy, and had industry thriving through engineering and technology, but also made a contribution to well-being. And to your point, it was always wonderful with people, and that's been a clear message that's come through time and time again. And very briefly, I remember only a few years ago when Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip visited Glasgow, they came to my own university, the University of Strathclyde, to open the Technology and Innovation Centre. And we took them on separate tours. Prince Philip went first to our quantum technology labs, and we had all of our engineers and indeed industrial partners lined up to explain to the Prince what technology was all about and quantum theory. And they demonstrated some great experiments. This was about ion traps and the interaction between atoms and light. But of course, the Prince started to ask rather probing questions about laser technology, which certainly drew our academics up short. This was a very informed visitor. They had also put together an interesting 3D model using ping pong balls, different colours and 3D shapes. Of course, they let them speak for a few minutes and then very seriously leant forward and said, "Could you take me back to the beginning now, please, and tell me how these ping pong balls have anything to do with quantum technology?" That left the academics, I have to say, somewhat flummoxed. And as he left them behind, he smiled wryly and said, "I'll be back later for the answer," and then turned and spent a great 5 or 10 minutes with our PhD students. And later in that same visit, we were talking to him about white space communications. This is a technique that accesses parts of the radio frequency spectrum that are underutilized and particularly useful to access remote communities. So we had set up a live link in Kenya at treetops. Of course, we hadn't told them where the broadcast was coming from, but we enabled the broadcast. And within seconds, he recognized the profile of the land, he recognized the topography, and he said, "This is treetops, isn't it?" And of course, we were delighted he had recognized it, and we again spent some time responding to very probing questions about the future of communication systems. Clearly, this was something that went all the way back to his time as a naval officer with his interest in engineering. But once we had finished, and rather than move on to the next exhibit, he wanted to stay on and speak to our technicians, and that's exactly what he did. Very people-oriented, no fuss, but a deep interest in engineering and technology. And we have a sad loss now on our hands with our senior fellow, but we will push forward with his legacy, attracting people into engineering and putting engineering at the heart of the UK economy.
Well, I love your story, Sir Jim, because that combines the sense of humour, which people have been reflecting on in the last few hours, but also a great passion. I mean, just briefly, were you able to get a sense of where that passion had originated. I mean, was it essentially from his time in the Navy? Was it just something he was genuinely interested in and thought would help young people and would create jobs as well?
Indeed, undoubtedly his time in the Navy and indeed his expertise as a pilot brought his own personal interest into engineering, science and technology. But the passion for allowing young people to be excited about engineering, about technology was clearly driving all of this. And where I had the privilege of seeing him particularly engage with those that he spoke to was with young people, asking genuinely about their interests, encouraging them to challenge themselves. And that was an inspiration not only for the young people, but for those of a more mature nature like myself that saw him inspire others. And he will continue to do that, I have no doubt. And the Academy will take that banner forward with pride as we put engineering front and centre.
Sir Jim MacDonald, thank you so much for your reflections. Thank you so much for joining us there from Ayrshire. Sir Jim MacDonald, President of the Royal Academy of Engineering there, speaking to us from Ayrshire in Scotland. Well, the Duke of Edinburgh had an obvious but also personal and close association with Scotland, dating back to his school days in the 1930s, of course. He and the Queen have enjoyed holidays with family at Balmoral every autumn for many decades, as Glenn Campbell reports.
At Holyrood Palace, the lion rampant is lowered, as the city that has long shared its name with the Duke of Edinburgh takes in the news posted on the palace gates that His Royal Highness has died 2 months short of his 100th birthday.
I do feel incredibly sad. I think it will be a great loss, and he was a real character.
The Prince has been around for 99 years and has been at the Queen's side the entire time. So it's a huge loss to the country, especially given his long service.
In Ballater on Royal Deeside, some remember a prince they met in person.
We're walking in Ballacabooey Forest and this black Range Rover came up and the Duke got out and was fixing something at the side of the road. He must have been 94.
A character that we can all identify with. Yeah, sad. And I feel so sorry for the dear Queen.
From his school days to big national moments like the opening of the Scottish Parliament, the Duke of Edinburgh's association with Scotland was lifelong. The royal couple were regular attenders of the Highland Games when they summered at Balmoral.
I think Prince Philip loved Aberdeenshire because of the peace and quiet, and indeed the outdoors. A man who was an accomplished sportsman. He loved attending the Braemar Gathering, the Ballater Games. I think he loved the competitive nature of Highland Games.
In Glasgow, more memories and reflections.
Absolutely gutted. I honestly thought that he was going to get to the 100. I think a lot of people actually wished that he was going to get to that 100, and gutted for the Queen.
I did the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, and that is something very positive he's gave to the community.
And from Inverness,
you kind of felt that it was coming, but it was still a bit of a shock at the same time when you heard about it.
Yeah, it was just like a shame you didn't make it to like 100. Like, it was so close to like his 100th, and he was like a pillar of like the royal family and like quite an icon.
More tributes will be paid at Holyrood on Monday when Parliament is recalled to remember a remarkable prince. Glenn Campbell, Edinburgh.
It was at Treetops Lodge in Kenya where life changed for the Duke of Edinburgh. It was there that he had to tell his wife that King George had died and that she was Queen. More from our Africa correspondent, Catherine Burehanga. This is from Treetops Lodge, where the royal couple stayed many years ago.
The royal visitors stepped off into the hot sunshine of Nairobi. It was just a week ago today.
Prince Philip often told the story of how his wife came here a princess. They went up into the tree house, and when they came down the next day, she was queen. But at that moment, they didn't know that her father had passed away in the night. And it wasn't until they got to a royal residence not too far away from here that he was tasked with the duty of having to tell her that her father had died and that she was now queen.
The Queen's plan was to walk to the site of the original treetops, where a few stones of the building remain.
This was a moment that transformed both their lives, but also personally for Prince Philip. He was a Navy officer with a promising career, but he had to give that up in order to support his wife. And he took on many roles supporting the monarch and would step in when required. So, for example, in 1963, when Kenya gained independence, he took part in the handover ceremony, standing in for his wife. And over the decades, he's travelled across this continent, particularly representing the Commonwealth, which right now stands as a major legacy for Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth.
Well, we are here from Windsor Castle throughout the day, of course, on BBC News, as members of the public continue to arrive. There's really very much a steady stream, a sizable numbers of people arriving all the time, a lot of them holding flowers that they are directed to leave. Of course, during the pandemic, given the pandemic, the public are being asked to not gather in crowds and to keep away. But of course, people want to be here to remember the Duke of Edinburgh. Hello, if you are joining us from within the UK or around the world. This is special BBC News coverage from Windsor Castle following the death of the Duke of Edinburgh at the age of 99. Gun salutes will take place across the UK today to mark an extraordinary life of duty and service. Prince Philip was by the Queen's side for more than 70 years. The royal family is mourning the loss of a beloved husband and father.
If you were having problems, you could always go to him and know that he would listen and try to help.
I think he'd probably want to be remembered as, as an individual in his own right, really.
Details about the Duke's funeral are likely to be released later today, as tributes are paid here at Windsor, across the country and around the world. Flags are flying at half-mast across the UK, including at Buckingham Palace, where small numbers of people have been gathering to pay their respects.
Naval ensigns are flying at half-mast across the naval base here at Portsmouth in preparation for the 41-gun salute, which will take place at midday.
We'll be reflecting on the Duke's far-reaching legacy and hearing from those whose lives he touched. Hello and a very warm welcome to this BBC News special. I am Jane Hill at Windsor Castle, where people are arriving all the time to pay their respects to the Duke of Edinburgh. The armed forces will lead a second day of tributes to the Duke, who died yesterday at the age of 99. Gun salutes will take place across the UK, in Gibraltar and from warships at sea. That will happen in about an hour's time. We also think that we will hear details of the Duke's funeral. We think they will be announced a little later in the day. Prince Philip was, of course, the longest-serving royal consort in British history. He was a constant support to the Queen during more than 70 years of marriage. Throughout the day, we will be looking back at his life with people who knew him, people who worked with the Duke, and people whose lives were touched by his charitable endeavours and public duties. We'll also discuss how his legacy will live on. Our first report this hour is from our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
The Duke's death will be a grievous loss for the Queen after their 73 years of marriage. Last night on a BBC programme, their eldest children paid tribute to him.
I think he'd probably want to be remembered as, as an individual in his own right, really.
His appreciation of how he could help Queen always seemed to be present in terms of supporting her, because she was very young when she became Queen, and it needed to be, I think, a double act for a lot of that time in order to allow her to take on that role.
It was in August 2017 on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace that the Duke carried out his final solo engagement, inspecting a parade by the Royal Marines. It was pouring with rain, yet the Duke, who was then 96, was not to be deterred. Duty came first that day, as it had for so many decades, so often alongside the Queen, but also pursuing his own public programme, to which he brought his own famously forthright style. But the public image of the Duke walking a few paces behind his wife only tells part of the story. His greatest contribution was the unseen support he gave to the Queen as she coped with the often solitary role of head of state. Occasionally she alluded to it. "He is my constant strength and guide," she said during the Diamond Jubilee. He was the one person she could always turn to. Just before his 90th birthday, the Duke had said in a BBC interview that he felt it was time to wind down.
I reckon I've done my bit. I want to enjoy myself for a bit now. With less responsibility, less frantic rushing about, less preparation, less trying to think of something to say.
Yet it wasn't until 6 years later and that parade in the pouring rain on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace that there was any real evidence that he was retiring. Now the Queen must continue without him. The world will pay its tributes to a man of strong personality who made a significant contribution to the nation's life. And his family will mourn a much-loved father, grandfather, great-grandfather and husband. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Well, with me here at Windsor Castle is our royal correspondent, Sarah Campbell. And Sarah, in fact, in the last hour, we have seen one member of the royal family arrive.
Yes, indeed. Prince Edward, the Earl of Wessex, the Queen and Prince Philip's youngest son drove past here and through those gates, and surely that will be some comfort to the Queen today as she sort of reflects on the loss of the man who was the most important person in her life. Of course, we knew that Prince Charles travelled here from Highgrove yesterday to add his comfort, to add his words to her, and I think it's worth reflecting, and this will be reflected in households across the UK over this past most difficult year, that whilst we've been talking about the fact that the Queen has spent a lot of time with the Duke because they've been isolating, shielding here at Windsor Castle, actually for the children and the wider family for whom we know the Duke was such an important father figure. You know, we talk about the Queen sort of taking on the public role in public, but actually privately he very much was sort of the head of the household, and they have been deprived of direct contact with him over the last year because of the pandemic. And Prince Charles spoke before Christmas. He sort of said, you know, even though talked about the social media, you know, the Zoom calls, whatever else, but he said it's not the same as being able to give somebody a hug. So I'm sure there will be sadness amongst the wider family that their connection with him has been much less than it otherwise would have been over the last year. And Prince Edward, in the documentary that was shown last night, there were some really nice tributes from the children to their father, and it's just worth reflecting what he said. He said about his father, it was always a challenging role, but he's done it with the most extraordinary flair, never tried to overshadow the Queen, and I think he's always been there as that rock in the Queen's life, and within the family that was the same. So clearly some reflection of just how important Prince Philip was to the family.
Yes, and such a difficult year for families up and down the country, and in one sense the royal family wasn't immune to that. The Queen and Prince Philip had their own small lockdown with just a very small number of staff with them for much of the last year, really.
Yeah, it's all referred to as HMS bubble, but really since March 2020, because before that time, the Duke of Edinburgh retired in August 2017, and he spent much of his time on the Sandringham estate in a little cottage there. The Queen, obviously carrying on her role as the monarch, was having to spend much more time in Windsor, in London, carrying out her official royal duties. So the pandemic brought them together, brought them here to Windsor Castle, and probably spent more time than they otherwise would have done, simply because there weren't royal engagements for the Queen to go to. But yes, as we say, for the wider family, and that's something that many families across the country will really be able to empathise with, they have been separated, they have been isolated. And going forward, the funeral, we're expecting to have some details released this afternoon. Of course, a royal funeral will have been planned years and years in advance, but who could have planned for a pandemic? And that will mean that changes will have to be made to those plans, because there is a clear feeling that we cannot have funeral processions, anything that's going to bring lots of people out onto the streets, that is going to be avoided. And also physically, the numbers of people who will be allowed to attend his funeral, it would have been hundreds of people, but now that's going to be in tens, about 30 people. So how's that going to be organised? So like I say, the Queen has to approve those plans, sign off those plans, and as soon as she has, they will be made public.
All right, for now, thank you very much, Sarah Campbell, our royal correspondent. Well, the household cavalry has marked Prince Philip's death with a salute. Mounted soldiers rode through the streets of Windsor before saluting in front of the castle here. And let's find out what is happening in other parts of the country. Let's head first to Buckingham Palace in London. Our correspondent Sangeeta Maiska is there. And tell us what's been happening where you are over the course of the morning, Sangeeta.
Well, Jane, of course, Buckingham Palace, so much the centrepiece of public life here in the UK, a place of both celebration and today commemoration. Much as it was yesterday, there's been a steady stream of people coming through past the palace gates, leaving flowers and just stopping to remember, reflect and pay their respects to Prince Philip and to keep in their thoughts Her Majesty the Queen. Almost everyone I speak to talks about his sense of duty, about his sense of purpose and how he served the country, not just as a naval officer during World War II, but as the Queen's consort. Two of those I spoke to, Jackie and daughter Grace, really quite overcome with emotion as they laid their flowers here today. This is what they had to say.
Yes, they really mean a lot to us, and I think, this gets so much slack, but I think the majority of the British public, they really support them, and they just appreciate, especially in this time of COVID, that they've been such a strength and constant in our lives. Yeah.
And this is Grace, your daughter.
This is Grace, yeah.
Hello, Grace. Is it important for you? I see you've brought some flowers. Tell us what you've brought.
She wanted to bring the flowers for Prince Philip because, she hears about him, she sees them on the telly, and we live very close, we live just around the corner, so she's grown up here, and it's been a part of her life too.
I've no doubt.
He's such a special man. You just see him all the years he's been there and he's never wavered, and we just appreciate him so much.
I think what's really interesting, actually, is the number of people who are bringing their children, really young children. And when I speak to the parents, they say, we just hope that our kids will just remember a little bit of us coming here and paying our respects, because there is so much love and affection for the Queen, and they want their children to remember what an important part Prince Philip played in her life. I was looking back at Buckingham Palace this morning, just looking at the balcony behind me. Isn't that so much the scene that we have seen at every important occasion in this country? Prince Philip standing right next to the Queen, always there by her side, surrounded often by his family. The flag, of course, the Union flag at half-mast today over Buckingham Palace in tribute to Prince Philip. As the day moves on, the palace and the government again stressing that we are still in the middle of a pandemic and asking people to respect those social distancing rules. Many people have lost their lives. The palace more aware of that than many, and urging people to make a donation to their favourite charity in the name of Prince Philip rather than come here. If you find yourself coming here, you will be moved on quickly. You may be allowed to lay your flowers and then you'll be expected to exit. More from us as the day goes on. Jane, back to you.
Thank you, Sangeeta Singidin-Maiska there at Buckingham Palace. Just in the last few moments, a statement has come through from the Vatican on behalf of Pope Francis expressing his regrets at the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. Let me just read a little of that statement. We are saddened to hear of the death of Prince Philip. His Holiness Pope Francis offers heartfelt condolences to Her Majesty and to members of the royal family. Recalling Prince Philip's devotion to his marriage and family, his distinguished record of public service and his commitment to education and the advancement of future generations, His Holiness commends him to the merciful love of Christ our Redeemer. That is part of the statement just released by the Vatican. Well, we are reflecting on the many tributes that are being paid across the country and across the Commonwealth and the world. We're also talking about the 41-gun salute, of course, that will happen at midday British time. Our reporter John Maguire is in Portsmouth. That is one of the gun salutes will be taking place there, of course. John.
Yeah, Jane, Portsmouth Naval Base, of course, the largest of the Royal Navy's bases here in the UK. As I'm talking to you now, I can just see behind two of the new aircraft carriers with their naval ensign flying at half-mast. The Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales, of course, named after the Duke's wife and his eldest son, respectively. The guns that will take part in the 41-gun salute, there are those three 3-pound guns there. 2 will fire the 3-pound shells. The other one is a reserve. They will fire a round on each minute. So starting at midday, it'll obviously take 41 minutes. There are going to be similar tributes at the national capitals across the UK and also on board ship and at various military bases in the UK, also Gibraltar as one example. And the 41-gun salute sits right at the top of the ceremonial tributes in extremely rare honour. And I think it's being done today not only in recognition of the Duke of Edinburgh's decades-long royal service, but also, of course, his military career. He was a naval officer in the Second World War. He was mentioned in dispatches for one sea battle that took place off the coast of Greece in action against the Italian Navy. A lot of people have been talking in the last 24 hours or so about the fact that his naval career was, of course, cut short once his wife acceded to the throne. Would he have carried on? Would he have reached right to the top and become perhaps First Sea Lord, the overall commander of the British Royal Navy? That's obviously a point of conjecture, but clearly it was a service that he very much enjoyed being part of when he was a young officer, one of the youngest first lieutenants on board a ship during the war, and spent an extremely busy time. And he, of course, has maintained contact with the Royal Navy, as with all of the other armed services, but in particular, I think, the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines during recent years. His last public appearance, in fact, was with the Royal Marines just a little while ago. So as you can see, the crew there with their white flash hoods on, they'll be performing the ceremonial duties, as will others, in tribute to, I suppose, someone who up until his death yesterday would have been very much one of their brothers, one of their comrades in arms. He always enjoyed meeting servicemen and women. There was a great story I heard yesterday where he flew in to see Royal Marines up in Norway doing their Arctic warfare training, covered in snow, obviously. He was scheduled to sit down and have a formal lunch with the commanding officer there, but instead decided to sit down with the lads with their mess tins, just chow down with them, and used up all of the VIP time, if you like, talking to the Royal Marines in one of the troops there. So it gives you, I think, a measure of the man that he always very much enjoyed, perhaps doing the unpredictable, but certainly getting a good idea of how everything worked, from the nuts and bolts of something like an aircraft carrier or a jet or a helicopter, to just trying to find out about the boots and the food that the other non-commissioned men and women would have been experiencing in their service. So, as I say, Portsmouth Naval Base very much preparing for, I think, what will be a very auspicious and a very special occasion.
John, many thanks. John Maguire in Portsmouth. And of course, we are going to have full coverage of the 41-gun salute, as you would expect. My colleague Katie Austin is in another part of Windsor. And Katie, you have moved to another part of the town because we reflect on the fact that lots of people are arriving here, lots of people bringing flowers. And many of the flowers that have already been left have been moved, I think, to where you are. Explain what's happening there in one other part of Windsor.
That's right, we're at the top of the Long Walk in Windsor Great Park. The park itself here is very busy with people out walking with their families, with their dogs, or just out for exercise. And yes, behind me you can probably see there are some flowers which have been left outside the gates there. The advice to the public is, of course, not to travel, not to turn up to bring flowers and leave tributes. But still, some people, as they go about their walks this morning, have been standing for a moment of reflection, leaving some flowers. There are some cards that have been left there as well. A lot of the people we've seen coming here have been families, and some of the messages are very obviously from children. One message has been written talking about how the child who wrote it looks forward to learning about Prince Philip as at school, one would presume. But yeah, a steady stream of people coming past here. It's not too busy, of course. Everyone's very keen to avoid crowds, as we still are under COVID restrictions, and social distancing is being encouraged. Yes, we think the flowers that were laid yesterday have been removed, but fresh ones have been put there this morning. The plastic wrapping is being taken off, so a very lovely display behind me. Everything from simple daffodils to something a little bit more elaborate. We know that the Queen is in residence here at Windsor, as well as she mourns the passing of her husband of more than 70 years.
Katie, thank you. Katie Austin there. And really quite a lot of people here in Windsor today. The crowd's very much building over the last hour or so. Quite quiet much earlier this morning when we first arrived, but now there really is scores and scores of people arriving here at Windsor Castle. Well, political parties across the UK have suspended their campaigning, of course, because we are in the run-up to elections on the 6th of May, but we had that announcement shortly after the death of the Duke of Edinburgh was announced, that political campaigning would be halted as a mark of respect. And we know that MPs are being asked to return to Parliament on Monday, and that is actually a day early following the Easter recess. Let's talk to our political correspondent Helen Catt, who is in Downing Street. And Helen, in addition to that, we expect that we will hear a few more details a little later on today about funeral arrangements, which has some government involvement as well.
We are expecting to hear that, yes, although very much when it comes to things like the funeral, to these sort of arrangements, it's very much that the palace who will take the lead on this. Government's role is really to be sort of supportive, to take a bit of a step back really publicly and just facilitate what it is that the palace decides and the palace wants. And so here in Downing Street this morning it is very quiet. The flags, like they are on government buildings across the country, flying at half-mast, like they are along Whitehall and like they are in Parliament. And this is how it's going to stay politically for a few days yet. As you said, campaigning has been suspended in elections taking place on May the 6th. In terms of government business, while the business of government will still go on, it'll be done in a very different way, much more muted. So we won't get any big government announcements. We won't see ministers going on visits. We won't see ministers touring the TV studios as we usually would. The exception will be if there are any big public health announcements that need to be made because of the pandemic. But apart from that, expect things to be very quiet here from ministers and from the government. Ministers say they've already received thousands of messages of condolence from across the world on the Duke of Edinburgh, and on Monday MPs, as you said, will be coming back to Parliament a day early to pay their own tributes. The Prime Minister will be leading those. They'll start at 2:30, so Keir Starmer will respond, and then individual MPs will be able to pay their own tributes to the Duke of Edinburgh. That's expected to last several hours until 10 o'clock at night, and we're expecting individual MPs to make their own tributes, because of course the Duke of Edinburgh didn't have a formal constitutional role, but I think MPs will want to pay tribute to the role that he played, that major role he did play in UK public life over 7 decades.
Helen Catt, thank you very much in Downing Street. Well, let's take some time to reflect on the life and legacy of the Duke of Edinburgh. With me here at Windsor Castle is the royal biographer, author and historian Robert Lacey. Robert, very good of you to be with us here on BBC News. And at the end of a year in which the whole nation has talked so much about loss and grief and death, and families have been through such a difficult year, and now the Queen herself woke up this morning a widow.
Yes. She has, of course, had the curious blessing because of COVID for the last year of actually having the Duke here in her bubble. Rather unexpected, because he'd taken retirement to Sandringham. And one of the happy results, therefore, was that he came to be with her. You know, we speculate about these things. There's so much that he gave to her life. People have been talking about it endlessly. I would just pick out one thing, is his sense of humour. I'm sure that's one of the things you'll be missing terribly. I mean, everybody here, all of us, I think it's one of the reasons why people feel drawn to come here, is we all knew his sometimes ghastly sense of humour, the so-called gaffes. Well, she was the principal recipient of that. And the Queen, for all her seriousness and duty, has a very humorous side. She has this ability to put things in humorous terms. When this castle had burnt down, she was the person who comes up with this phrase, annus horribilis, and turns what had been a sad occasion into something positive. Well, the Duke was very much her partner in doing that sort of thing.
Yes, and strength and stay, and that is the phrase we remember so vividly.
And always done with such subtlety. I mean, he was such a man's man, somebody with such determined opinions, but never did he upstage his wife. He was always not just literally one step behind, but never did he trespass into her area. I mean, as I look at Windsor, I think of how, after the death of Diana, he identified the particular problems that William and Harry would be having in this period, and the way in which the boys were just down the road at Eton, at school. And he was the one who suggested that the Queen and he should invite them up for Sunday lunch. And so William and Harry would come up here for Sunday lunch, not every week, because other weeks they go with their father and so on. And Prince Philip suggested to the Queen this would be a good opportunity with William to start preparing him for his future responsibilities. And perhaps they could talk about this sort of thing after lunch. And my point here about Philip is that, having set all this up and had the lunch with William, at that point, when the time came for the serious talk about the future, Prince Philip would quietly leave the room and leave grandmother and grandson alone to create this special bond, which of course we see today. I mean, very much. Prince William is, you know, he's close to Prince Charles, obviously, but I think as we look to the future of the monarchy, Prince William very much takes his tone from his grandmother, but then also his grandfather too. I mean, when you see Prince William, I always think, you know, sort of Prince Philip is standing there.
And we forget, going back that many decades, that must have been a very difficult thing for a man with a successful naval career at that time to have to do, to step back at a time when that really wasn't done. You know, we're only just getting there with egalitarianism between the genders as it is. And to go, that many years ago, he knew what he was taking on, but nonetheless, to do it was difficult for a man with leadership qualities.
Yes, and with dignity. Yes, you're right. I mean, he wasn't quite the first house husband, but right back then in the 50s, when thinking was so conventional by our standards, the way in which he was able to subordinate his bubbling ideas and personality and channel it all into support of his wife. Because she realized his difficulties. She was looking for jobs she could give him. She gave him the job of looking after the coronation, which horrified the courtiers. They didn't like that idea at all. And he, of course, came up with the idea of televising the coronation, which the courtiers didn't want, and he pushed for it. And of course, that proved
They
to
would
be...
have thought he was quite radical, I assume, for suggesting that.
Well, you know, in all sorts of ways that people have been talking about, the courtiers were suspicious of him. Courtiers don't really like change. That's their job, really, to keep things solid and as they've been. So this energetic young man comes in with all his ideas. No, he wasn't well received. And of course, he had this particular grievance at that time, cultivated a bit by his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, that the family name should be changed. And no more Windsors. It's Edinburgh or Mountbatten now. And he accepted the fact that the government, Winston Churchill, backed by the Queen, and particularly, of course, the Queen Mother, wouldn't accept that. A paradox, but always, well, here we are remembering doing his duty and supporting his wife, but also contributing so much to everyone else's life.
Robert Lacey for now. Thank you very much indeed. I know you'll stay with us. We'll talk more to Robert, the author and historian and biographer, a little later here on BBC News. But as my colleague Sarah Campbell mentioned a short while ago, we have seen Prince Edward here at Windsor Castle, the Duke's youngest son, of course. He arrived here in a car at the castle within the last hour or so. And driving through the gates just behind me there in the last hour. Well, the Duke of Edinburgh had an obvious and personal and close association with Scotland. It, of course, dated back to his school days. He went to Gordonstoun in the 1930s. He and the Queen have enjoyed holidays with the family at Balmoral every autumn for many decades. Our correspondent Glenn Campbell reflects on that.
At Holyrood Palace, the lion rampant is lowered, as the city that has long shared its name with the Duke of Edinburgh takes in the news posted on the palace gates that His Royal Highness has died 2 months short of his 100th birthday.
I do feel incredibly sad. I think it will be a great loss, and he was a real character.
The Prince has been around for 99 years and has been at the Queen's side the entire time. So it's a huge loss to the country, especially given his long service.
In Ballater on Royal Deeside, some remember a prince they met in person.
We're walking in Ballacabooey Forest and this black Range Rover came up and the Duke got out and was fixing something at the side of the road. He must have been 94.
A character that we can all identify with. Yeah, sad. And I feel so sorry for the dear Queen.
From his school days to big national moments like the opening of the Scottish Parliament, the Duke of Edinburgh's association with Scotland was lifelong. The royal couple were regular attenders of the Highland Games when they summered at Balmoral.
I think Prince Philip loved Aberdeenshire because of the peace and quiet, and indeed the outdoors. A man who was an accomplished sportsman. He loved attending the Braemar Gathering, the Ballater Games. I think he loved the competitive nature of Highland Games.
In Glasgow, more memories and reflections.
Absolutely gutted. I honestly thought that he was going to get to the 100. I think a lot of people actually wished that he was going to get to that 100, and gutted for the Queen.
I did the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, and that is something very positive he's gave to the community.
And from Inverness,
You kind of felt that it was coming, but it was still a bit of a shock at the same time when you heard about it.
Yeah, it was just like a shame you didn't make it to like 100. Like it was so close to like his 100th, and he was like a pillar of like the royal family and like quite an icon.
more tributes will be paid at Holyrood on Monday when Parliament is recalled to remember a remarkable prince. Glenn Campbell, Edinburgh.
And let's go to Edinburgh and join our correspondent Alexandra Mackenzie. And Alexandra, I wonder whether you, as we are here in Windsor, are seeing people arriving and people just pausing and reflecting.
Yes, that's right. We're just here in the front of Edinburgh Castle. The gun salute for Scotland will happen here at Edinburgh Castle at noon. And yes, there are a few people around. It's probably some of them have come to enjoy the views, enjoy the sunshine. Others are in Edinburgh today, possibly remembering the Duke of Edinburgh. People have been told not to gather, to stay at home and watch the gun salute at home. But yes, there are a few people around here today. And as we were seeing there in Glenn's package, the Duke of Edinburgh has touched so many lives, not just here in the city, but also across Scotland, in Royal Deeside particularly, where the royal family used to go on so many of their holidays. But back in the 30s, he went to school in Gordonston, way up in Murray, and he seemed to enjoy his time at Gordonston, making a bit of an impact there, particularly in sport. He was the captain of the hockey team, he was captain of the cricket team, and he was also head boy. And we have had a statement from Gordonston, and Lisa Kerr, the principal there, she has said the Gordonston community has joined together to convey their condolences. She said he was supportive of pupils fulfilling not only their academic potential, but also developing life skills. And she also said, we are immensely grateful for his support over the years, and his presence and support in school life will be sorely missed. Now, he kept in touch with Gordonston over the years. He was there around 5 years ago for the 80th anniversary, and the principal was saying that instead of sitting with them to have his lunch, he wanted to mingle with the pupils. He wanted to find out who they were, what they were up to, and talk to them about their education and aspirations. And also in Edinburgh here, he was Chancellor of the university for almost 60 years, and we've had a statement from the university. They said they were proud that he'd served as Chancellor from 1953 to 2010, and they mentioned his passionate belief in education, which we keep hearing about, and his, in their words, his innate inquisitiveness in scientific development. And they said his tireless service was greatly appreciated by all. So this was definitely a man who touched the lives of many across Scotland.
And from Edinburgh for now, thank you very much. That's Alexandra Mackenzie. Well, let's talk about the Duke of Edinburgh's life and legacy now with Ian Lloyd, who's the author of The Duke, 100 Chapters in the Life of Prince Philip. Thank you for joining us, Ian Lloyd. And I know you spoke to a large number of people in preparation for your book. Tell us more about what you learnt, what people said to you.
I think the thing that surprised me about doing the book was that the sensitive side of Prince Philip, the side that he quite often chose to hide. For instance, he had a love of poetry, which one biographer mentioned to the Queen Mother. She said, "I've never heard of it." Princess Margaret happened to be there, and she said, the Queen Mother said, "Did you know about this love of poetry?" And Margaret said, "No, not at all." But he had apparently over 200 poetry books in his collection, in his library, and 1,000 books of art, and about 500 books on religion. He was, a widely read man who chose to hide that side, and there was a very soft side to him. For instance, he was a great letter writer. Lady Mountbatten, the late Lady Mountbatten, told me that when her son was killed in the atrocity which killed Earl Mountbatten of Burma, she, of course, wasn't able to go to the funeral because she was very seriously injured. But Prince Philip wrote her a sort of 10-page letter with all the details of the funeral that a mother would want to know. And that was very thoughtful, and she found it a great help. And there was a story about somebody who, a yachtsman who he'd met at Cowes, didn't know very well, but the man who was dying of cancer. Prince Philip wrote him a long letter again and enclosed an honour that he felt the man should have. So there was a side that he didn't really sort of like to show. I think he was that generation that kept those sort of things private, really.
Yes, that's interesting, because I was about to ask you, I wonder why people felt that was indeed the case, but whether it was his upbringing, his schooling, and I'm interested in what people had said to you about his very difficult early years.
Well, of course, he had a very problematic childhood, and I think he coped by sort of bottling it up. I mean, I think I was told by one that, in his childhood it was either sink or swim, and he very much decided to swim because of the his mother was taken to a sanatorium. She had very terrible mental issues. His 4 sisters married all within 8 months of each other, and his father went to Monte Carlo with a mistress. So he was effectively an orphan, if you like, during his teenage years. Actually, one of them did say, and it's quite an interesting thing, that he found, in a way, the home he'd always craved for with the royal family, because, of course, they're the most secure of families, in that the lifestyle the Queen leads is pretty similar to the one Queen Victoria led in terms of living at Balmoral, Windsor Castle, and so on. It was a rock-solid institution, and the court she grew up in, the George VI and Queen Elizabeth, and the 2 princesses, they called themselves Us 4. They were a very tight unit, and Prince Philip found the home and the security that I think he probably craved for, and which I'd never thought about, really, looking back. But I think the Queen actually gave him a lot of security, and the House of Windsor, if you like.
Ian Lloyd, thank you very much for joining us. Well, senior church figures have been paying tribute to Prince Philip for his service as consort to a Christian monarch, with his own faith a central part of his life. We're going to talk more about that and just how important the Christian faith is, of course, as we know, to the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, and we'll take some time to reflect on that in the next few minutes. Let's right now, though, just turn our attentions abroad. Lots of responses and tributes being paid from overseas. In Australia, there has been a military tribute to the Duke. A series of gun salutes fired 41 rounds outside Parliament House. The flag over Sydney Harbour Bridge has been lowered to half-mast, as has the one over Parliament House in the capital. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said that memories of Prince Philip will be of his candour and of a unique, forceful and authentic personality. Well, let's find out a little bit more about those gun salutes that are taking place here in the UK. That's happening at midday British time. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale joins me. And the significance of the gun salutes, Jonathan, because they're fired as well from ships at sea.
Yeah, 2 ships at sea, HMS Montrose, which is in the Gulf, and HMS Diamond, which is just off the south coast, left Portsmouth, with its white ensign lowered yesterday, will be taking part in this 41-gun salute. I think the focus will be probably at the barracks in Woolwich, where the King's Troop, the Royal Horse Artillery, who traditionally do this role for heads of state. 21-gun salute is normal, but obviously this is a special occasion, an important occasion for the nation and for the Commonwealth. So it's a 41-gun salute, 1 round fired every minute. They will be using the King's Troop, the same guns from the First World War that were used for the marriage, the wedding to the Queen by the Duke of Edinburgh, and also at the coronation. There is a significance there. Also, we will see guns salute from the Tower of London, but also in Cardiff, in Edinburgh and Belfast. And then, of course, there's a focus, a particular naval focus. They will be fired in both Portsmouth and Devonport. It's always worth remembering that, the association the Duke of Edinburgh had with the Royal Navy goes from when he was an 18-month-old baby, rescued by a Royal Navy ship from Greece, and then he died the Lord High Admiral, a title bestowed on him by the Queen.
Thank you for now, Jonathan. Jonathan Beale, our defence correspondent. Well, as people continue to arrive here in Windsor, very many hundreds of people really here now at the castle. Let's speak to the royal editor of Hello magazine. Emily Nash joins me. Emily, your thoughts. You won't be able to see what I could see around here at Windsor, but really a very, very large number of people now. Lots of people bringing flowers. People just wanting to be here, I suppose. Your thoughts on what the nation feels today?
I think even though the Duke was 99 and we know he'd been in ill health, people are still shocked at the announcement of his death, and of course have great sympathy for the Queen and members of her family, and want to do what they can to show that support. And, you know, people are being mindful of social distancing regulations, but they want to do what they can. They're feeling the need to go to royal residences and place flowers, although we know that the palace have asked people to make donations to charities associated with the Duke or of their own choice in lieu of doing that. But I think it really demonstrates the sense of loss and emotion that people are experiencing.
Yes, as so very many families have this year across the UK, it has been such a difficult, traumatic year for so many thousands of people. But the royal family, in its own way, has gone through that as well. I mean, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh had to form their own COVID bubble here in Windsor with really quite a small number of staff. That's how they had to live over the course of the last year.
Absolutely, and I think it speaks volumes that they are doing everything still within the regulations. There are there's no attempt for to request special treatment because they're the royal family. They're very much going through what so many, as you say, hundreds of thousands of people in the UK have experienced, losing a loved one during this pandemic, and the incredibly difficult circumstances surrounding that, funeral arrangements, etc. And I think because so many of us have experienced that loss in the past year, it's something that's really striking a chord with people, and hence this outpouring of affection towards the Queen.
How are you doing? All right?
Emily Nash, for now, thank you very much from Hello Magazine. Well, as I promised, let's talk a little bit more about the importance of the Christian faith to the royal family. Senior church figures have been paying tribute to Prince Philip for his service as consort to a Christian monarch. I'm pleased to say I can speak now to a former chaplain to the Queen, Dr. Gavin Ashenden, who joins me, in fact, from Normandy, I believe. And thank you so much for your time. And in fact, I believe you have also a personal connection through your father, I believe, serving alongside Prince Philip.
Yes, my father and Prince Philip were both officers together on the same ship in the North Sea convoys, and so that was a fairly important time for obviously for them both. And my dad remembered the collegiality of those years very fondly, and used to give me messages to send to Prince Philip when I was at the palace or at the Windsor Castle from time to time.
Did he? What were some of his remembrances? How did he remember him? Because of course so many people talk about what a very high-flying career Prince Philip could have gone on to have had that been something that was open to him.
Yes, well, he was an immensely competent officer, and those experiences in the North Sea convoys were really quite terrifying. My father wrote about them in private memoirs, and I was just astonished at what so my dad and Prince Philip were exactly the same age, and what they went through together was really hard to imagine for those of us who haven't had to go through them. Dad thought that Prince Philip was just an excellent officer and a very good friend, and a marvellous man, and one he admired and liked very much.
And as we say, you were, of course, you are a former chaplain to Her Majesty the Queen, and we know that her personal Christian faith is of enormous importance to her. In your experience, was it equally important to the Duke of Edinburgh?
Yes, it was. I think, although expressed more privately, I mean, he was, as you've heard a lot of people say, a very private person in lots of ways. I mean, not many people know that the two most important women in his life were profoundly influenced by the Christian faith. So his mother became a Greek Orthodox nun at the end of her life. She gave away all her belongings, albeit quite an eccentric one. She chain-smoked and played canasta. There weren't many nuns like her. But she also harbored Jewish refugees in her own flat during the war, risking her own liberty. And so She was, of course, an enormously important influence, and then his wife has showed the greatest possible Christian fortitude and example, and really been the most wonderful ambassador for Christianity, for authentic Christianity, in a period of time when the church has begun to lose some of its influence and grip on the popular imagination due to a whole series of factors. But Prince Philip and the Queen have been at the forefront of being part of the glue that's held together the really important values of Christian civilization, which I think we're going to miss as they become increasingly eroded.
And the coming days and weeks, the most difficult that one can imagine for any individual who has lost a partner of so very many decades standing, a desperately difficult time for the Queen. And I can only assume, I'm interested in your thoughts on whether her Christian faith will help sustain her during an immensely sad time.
Yes, well, Christians are used to dealing with death. After all, our whole faith is based on the death and resurrection of Christ. And for those who pray, there's a very real sense of the communion of saints. So if you like, Prince Philip has moved from one way of being to another, and the Queen will have been preparing, as a good Christian does, for her own death shortly. So although death is painful and the loneliness that follows it is hard to bear for all of us, nonetheless, at the heart of the Christian faith, there is this absolute certainty that we're going to meet again, because the real life we've been preparing for is about to start. I have no doubt at all that whilst the Queen will be profoundly saddened at the loss of her lifelong companion, her sense of the reality of God, the reality of heaven, the reality of life after death will be of an immense comfort and support to her, particularly at a time when it becomes so personal like this.
Very many thanks for your reflections this morning. Dr. Gavin Essendon, thank you very much, former chaplain to the Queen. Well, today, in fact, is something that we would be talking perhaps a lot about in normal times, but today is actually the Grand National Horse Race. The Queen, of course, hugely passionate about horses, as was the Duke of Edinburgh. So let's go to Aintree and speak to our sports correspondent, Andy Swiss, because that is something that will be remembered there where you are today, something that the royal family, the senior members, are so very passionate about.
That's right, Jane. Yes, it's really a chance for racing to pay its respects here today at Aintree. Prince Philip was an honorary member of the Jockey Club, and before racing started here yesterday, there was a 2-minute silence, and the same will happen again today before racing gets underway at around about 1:30. Again, the course will fall silent. All the flags around the course are at half-mast, and the jockeys are also being invited to wear black armbands. It is already a very subdued atmosphere to what we would normally expect at a Grand National, not least, of course, because there are no spectators here today. For the first time, the Grand National is taking place behind closed doors. And of course, across the sporting world, there will be tributes to Prince Philip here today. There'll be a silence before all the Premier League football matches, also before football matches in Scotland. But here in Aintree, as I say, the Grand National, very much the focus of the sporting world today, and racing will be very keen to pay its respects to Prince Philip before racing gets underway.
Andy, thank you very much for now. Andy Swiss at Aintree on a rather different Grand National today. We are going to bring you continuing coverage from here at Windsor, of course, but let's just remember now some of the lasting words and images of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, as we edge up to the 41 gun salute that will be happening across the UK and from ships at sea as well. Let's for now leave you with some of these images.
Hello and welcome to this special programme remembering the Duke of Edinburgh, whose death was announced by Buckingham Palace yesterday. In a few minutes' time, at midday UK time, a series of death gun salutes will be fired to mark his passing. Across the UK, in Gibraltar and on Her Majesty's ships at sea, saluting batteries will be fired. We will be bringing you coverage of this full military tribute to Prince Philip. And with me in the studio is our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale. Jonathan, just talk us through what we can expect in the next few minutes.
Yes, so at midday, we will see right across the country a salute, a death gun salute, as you say. 41 rounds will be fired around every minute. I think the focus will be probably at Woolwich, where the King's Troop, Royal Horse Artillery, will be firing their guns, their 13-pounder guns, which were used. They date back to the First World War, but they were used for both the royal wedding with the Queen and also at her coronation. Usually you would have a 21-gun salute for, say, a head of state coming, and you would see the Royal Horse Artillery out in Hyde Park. Obviously, we're in different times because of the pandemic, so they'll be doing it from their barracks in Woolwich, in the Parade Square. And at the same time, you will have a gun salute in Edinburgh, in Cardiff, in Belfast, and also given his close association with the Royal Navy, and that goes back from, when he was an 18-month-old, he was rescued by HMS Calypso when he left Greece. Right up until his death, he was still the Lord High Admiral of the Royal Navy, an honour bestowed by the Queen, a title that the Queen had. And as you say, there will be ships at sea. So we know HMS Montrose, which has been in the Gulf, I think is in Oman in port at the moment, but also HMS Diamond, which left Portsmouth with the white ensign flag lowered. Will be out on the south coast. Both of those ships will be firing, taking part in this royal salute.
Jonathan, as you're speaking, viewers can see pictures from the various venues that you've mentioned, looking at the moment at Woolwich Barracks, which you said is sort of a focal point. In usual times, we would expect to see big crowds here, but people are being discouraged from going. They're
being asked to watch from home and not to go and actually visit where these salutes are taking place. So it is an extraordinary time, and it's had an effect on the plans for the funeral, clearly, which you would have expected a very large military presence. There will be still a military presence, we understand. But clearly it has had to be altered, the plans for the funeral. But I mean, I think this is the military making clear that they saw him as one of theirs. This was a man who saw active service in the Royal Navy. In two notable incidents. First of all, in 1941, in the Battle of Cape Matapan off the coast of Greece, where he used the searchlights on the ship he was on. HMS Valiant, and he lit up with a searchlight an Italian cruiser, which they then opened fire on. And then in 1943, the invasion of Crete, he was on HMS Wallace, and he and the commanding officer of the ship at the time, he was a lieutenant, the Duke of Edinburgh, had the presence of mind because there were enemy bombers overhead, and it was getting dark. And they made the decision to make a raft, to tow the raft from behind the ship and to light up that raft to make sure that the ship wasn't hit, but this dummy raft was hit.
Great presence of mind.
Incredible presence of mind. And, those are the two, I think, incidents that stand out. But he was also, he was escorting, I think, again on HMS Wallace, convoys in the North Sea that came under attack from German torpedo boats, which fired at them. So, he is one of theirs. He is, if you go into a Royal Navy ship today in the wardroom, you will obviously see a picture of the Queen, but you will also often see a portrait of Prince Philip too. And as I said, he left this earth as somebody who was still having a Royal Navy title as the Royal High Admiral. He was somebody whose life was linked close to the Royal Navy, but also to the Army, to the Air Force too. He was one of theirs.
For viewers just joining us, you're joining a special programme remembering the Duke of Edinburgh. A series of death gun salutes are about to be fired across the UK at various venues, also in Gibraltar and on Her Majesty's ships at sea. And what you're seeing now is preparations for these salutes to start. This, as you can see, is at Woolwich Barracks in London. This is, as Jonathan was explaining, the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery. There are 71 horses there, 36 of them pulling 6 13-pounder field guns. And Jonathan, worth saying again, I think that those guns have a special significance, the ones in Woolwich.
Yeah, they date back from the First World War. And they are the guns that you would, as I said, normally see in Hyde Park when there's a visiting head of state, for example, fired usually a 21-gun salute, but this is a special occasion. I mean, they have fired a 41-gun salute for all births in the past. And remember that, you know, there was a similar salute when Queen Victoria died. There was a similar salute when Winston Churchill died as well.
Number 2!
Number 2!
15 seconds. Stand by.
Number 2 gun! Fire!
Shot over.
Load!
Countess of Wessex. Countess of Wessex, isn't it?
Yeah.
Prince Edward.
Yes.
Number 3! 4! 3! 4! Load!
So what we are watching is a coordinated series of gun salutes going on all across the United Kingdom and abroad. I'd like to bring in Jonathan Beale again. Just explain to viewers who are joining us just what we're watching.
So we're seeing right across the country this 41-gun death gun salute marking the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. And it involves the Royal Navy, who are firing their guns in Portsmouth Dockyard, home of the Royal Navy, and also in Devonport. I think you saw pictures earlier of them wearing their white flashes. They are ceremonial guns, essentially, that they're firing.
And we're going to be seeing this once every minute.
Once every minute. So one round fired every minute for 41 rounds. And it's not just here in the UK. So, you know, there are events in Edinburgh, in Belfast, in Cardiff, as I said, at Portsmouth and Devonport as well, but also in Gibraltar. We've already seen a similar salute take place in Canberra in Australia. And there will be one also in New Zealand later on.
Number 2. Number 2. Fire!
Jonathan, although we are only able to show one salute at each time, the idea is that these are all coordinated.
Yes, I mean, it's been carefully planned. I think it'll be some time before we actually see the ships at sea firing, because they've obviously got to send those pictures back. And as I said, that will be HMS Diamond. We think it's off the south coast at the moment. And then HMS Montrose, the frigate that's been operating in the Gulf. They won't be firing their main guns. They will be firing a ceremonial gun. And not just the Royal Navy, but also the Royal Artillery taking part in this salute as well as the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery. And there is one of the naval guns we can see at the moment.
Our correspondent John Maguire is in Portsmouth watching the gun salute there. And John, what is the atmosphere like?
I think probably...
Beg your pardon, clearly some problem there with the line from Portsmouth. This is the scene as you see it at Windsor Castle.
Number 1 gun! Fire!
And Jonathan Beale, our defence correspondent who's watching this with me in the studio, this is a solemn and quite a poignant moment, but a very personal one as well, because the Duke of Edinburgh is so identified with the military and, of course, particularly with the Navy.
Yes, I mean, you know, this is their way of honouring him. I think there will be other opportunities to show that as we get nearer the funeral, but you know, this is the first chance they've had to show what he meant to them, what he meant to the armed forces. And it wasn't just the Navy, he was Colonel-in-Chief to many regiments in the army. I think the last act we saw him do last year was when he handed over Colonel-in-Chief of the Rifles Regiment to Camilla. You know, he was doing this right up until the end. And as I said, you know, he died with the title Lord High Admiral. This is how they show their respect, their tribute, and we've heard it all from the defence chiefs who've all come out and paid their respect, and you know, talked about his character, his leadership, his inspiration throughout the years, not just his service, but in the time when obviously he'd left the Navy and took a more ceremonial duty. This tradition goes back to, it's a Navy tradition, it goes back to the 14th century.
Back to the 14th century.
They think it goes back to the 14th century. I think people will probably remember more recent events when, for example, the death of Queen Victoria, as I said, the death of Winston Churchill, that they fired a 41-gun salute like this. You know, these are sounds that the Duke would have heard from the same guns.
I'd like to go back now to our reporter John Maguire, who's at the naval base in Portsmouth. John, we're just seeing pictures now of of the guns there. What is the atmosphere like where you are?
Yes, as I was saying earlier, Rita, solemn really, but what we're seeing here, no doubt right across all of the guns that we're seeing, the ceremonial guns that we're seeing being fired, is military precision writ large. Here we are in Portsmouth, a large naval base. The two new Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers are just behind me. You can see their white ensigns on the back of them, on the staff, flying at half-mast. And indeed, the historic ship HMS Warrior has its red ensign flying at half-mast as well. These guns, as Jonathan has been describing, are ceremonial guns. They're used on all ships. It's a 3-pound gun. As you may be able to see, the crew of 6 there. They'll fire 2 guns, alternating, 1 each minute, allowing time for the other one to be reloaded and, of course, to cool down to a certain extent. Behind the gun-firing party, there are 3 other members of the Royal Navy, one obviously taking a tally, one with a stopwatch, and another one in charge of the men and women who are firing the guns here this morning. I must say they are extremely loud. The ground shakes when they fire, and I can see people in the waters just off Portsmouth here, the Gosport ferry, going backwards and forwards. Hopefully they know what today is all about. Of course, this tribute, this full military tribute, the 41-gun salute, as we've been hearing, extremely rare, is just reserved for some of the most important occasions in British life. And I think it honours not just Prince Philip's decades-long royal service, public service as the consort, by the side of and sometimes behind Her Majesty the Queen, but also, of course, his military career, which we've been hearing about over the last 24 hours or so. Served with the Royal Navy in the Second World War with some distinction, was mentioned in dispatches for the Battle of Matapan, and always felt very much, I think, a naval officer. A former First Sea Lord described to me earlier how he seemed to be the epitome of a naval officer, the straight back, the no-nonsense approach. And I think it was something that endeared him not only to members of the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines, as he was Captain General of the Royal Marines, but also to many other men and women in other areas of the armed forces. Whenever he visited, he was always very keen not just to talk to the top brass, as it were, but to find out exactly what was going on with the non-commissioned men and women as well, to discover what modern-day military life was like. We know and we've heard extensively how much he enjoyed his time in the Navy, full-time in the military, and one can only wonder what heights he would have reached had he stayed within the service. But this very coordinated, very specific honour that's being portrayed today seems very fitting to someone who dedicated so many years of his life to the armed forces.
And John, this was always going to be a solemn ceremonial occasion, but I imagine it is more muted than it might have been because of the COVID restrictions and the public being urged not to attend.
I think that's absolutely right. It'll probably be more self-evident at other locations where the 41-gun salute's being fired, other than where we are, obviously, on the naval base, because this is not an area that's open to the public, obviously, but whether or not they would have had arrangements for VIPs, current serving sailors, perhaps veterans as well, I'm sure there would have been a very different atmosphere today. But it's that sort of muted, as you say, although I must say that the guns are so loud it doesn't seem muted at all. But yes, you can imagine crowds gathering in certain locations if they were allowed to do so. But obviously not happening because of the pandemic restrictions today. And Buckingham Palace and the royal family have been at pains to ask people to respect the pandemic restrictions.
John Maguire, our reporter in Portsmouth, for the time being, thank you very much. I'd like to bring in the royal biographer and historian Robert Lacey, who is in Windsor, where Jane Hill is also bringing part of this programme. And Robert, you are watching, listening to this tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh, and I think worth reflecting at this moment again, the importance of the military to the Duke of Edinburgh.
Yes, I mean, and it was, of course, in a military context that the Queen first met Prince Philip at Dartmouth Naval College, and everybody here somehow is conscious of that link. There's a sort of feeling here of people wanting to give support to the Queen at this moment. We've just had Prince Edward and his wife Sophie have just driven past us here. They've obviously been to see their mother, and it reminds us, of course, that Prince Edward's going to be the next Duke of Edinburgh, not immediately, but following the death of the Queen. The title of Edinburgh will be carried on by Prince Edward, and then we'll have a Duchess of Edinburgh, in fact, in Sophie. They've been here, clearly giving support to the Queen, and there's a sort of feeling that that's what everybody here wants to do.
And what is the scene around you, Robert? Because as I was suggesting to our reporter John Maguire in Portsmouth, the public scenes are much more muted because of the COVID restrictions.
This is television. Thank you. Yes, as you can see, there are members of the public all around, although, there's also awareness, obviously, of COVID. People are distancing themselves. Quite a lot of people wearing masks, bringing children flowers and wreaths. A sense of, well, not really sorrow, but reverence and respect, but great quietness as people are waiting. We're not quite sure what we're not really aware of these guns going off. We're not hearing them here physically, but people seem aware of the fact that this is a great military tribute to the Duke, but there's a sort of personal feeling here most of all.
And just in terms of that personal link that Prince Philip had to the Navy and to the military, and it's been said in the last few days, it's been remarked upon quite extensively that he could have achieved high office in the Royal Navy if Princess Elizabeth hadn't become Queen when she did.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's pure speculation, but he was already a high-flying naval officer. He was doing very well at Dartmouth as a naval college when they first met. He served, as we've heard, at the Battle of Matapan. He is mentioned in dispatches. Of course, one of the happiest stages of the Queen's life was when she was able for a couple of years to be an ordinary naval officer's wife in Malta, and coming right up to the present day when there was the plan that didn't really come to anything for Prince Harry and Meghan to go and live for a period in the Commonwealth in Canada. That was said to have been inspired by the time that the Queen spent with Prince Philip in Malta, when, as a naval officer's wife, she could enjoy the pleasures of going to the shops and meeting with other service wives. Also, I think what people are thinking about here in Windsor, the curious blessing of COVID in that it brought the Queen and Prince Philip together for the last months of their lives. The Prince had been living for much of his retirement based in Sandringham, but because of COVID, he came to join the Queen in her bubble here. That, as I say, is what people around seem to be feeling. They're looking, taking photographs, somehow a feeling of both history and personal life moving on.
That's a very good way of summing it up. Thank you so much for the time being. That is Robert Lacey, historian and royal biographer. reserved officer to
Number 2 gun! Fire! Number 1 gun! Fire!
Well, we are about halfway through the 41 gun salute to the Duke of Edinburgh, and our correspondent on the ground there in Portsmouth, we were seeing Portsmouth just a few moments ago, saying how very loud these salutes are. I want to bring in my colleague Jonathan Beale, our defence correspondent, because it's a 41 shot salute. Why 41?
Yeah, I mean, usually when you have, for example, a head of state and you'd see the King Street Royal Horse Artillery coming, riding on their horses, pulling the guns into Hyde Park, it would be a 21 gun salute. But on special occasions, on important national occasions, they do fire a 41 gun salute. And part of it is, arcane procedures that go back to, firing 41 gun salute in a royal fortress, for example, as you would describe the Tower of London, or in a royal park, that you get that dispensation to do it. But I think clearly this is a most unusual event and an important national event. And I think it tells you that, the 41 gun salute is of significance, and it is not just a visiting head of state. This is something much more important for the country.
Jonathan, thank you. Let's listen in to a few more.
Number 3, fire! 3, ah! Load! Number 3 gun! Fire! Fire! Number 1 gun! Fire! Number 2.
Number 2!
Fire! Number 1. Number 1. Number 2 gun. Fire! Number 3, free! Fire! Number 2, load, collect. Number 2 gun! Fire! Number 3! Number 3! Fire! Fire!
Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale is in the studio with me watching this. And Jonathan, although we are only showing one salute at a time, this is in fact coordinated with, well, military precision.
Yes, and it's not something they'd normally do. You know, all four corners of the UK firing simultaneously in honour of the Duke's life. You know, usually it would just be what we'd have in London, essentially, with the King Street Royal Horse Artillery doing that ceremonial, essentially, role. And what they're also doing is, you can see, I mean, you know, in a number of locations they have batteries, so they're giving, you know, each gun crew time to reload, and alternating between each gun. So it is military precision.
5, 6, 7. Number 2, fire! 2, fire! Number 2, load, kill. Stand by, number 2 gun. Number 2 gun! Fire! Load! Number 3 gun! Fire! Load! Number 1 gun! Fire!
And Jonathan, it is the scale of this tribute that makes it remarkable, isn't it?
Yes, because as I was saying earlier, you know, you would normally see a gun salute take place in somewhere like Hyde Park, you know, on its own. But here you're seeing not just every corner of the UK taking part in this death gun salute, but you've got Gibraltar, where it appears to be raining, taking part. As I said, there are warships at sea, HMS Diamond, HMS Montrose in the Gulf, that are also taking part. You know, this is no small feat of coordination. But I also think it's, you know, it is the military right across the country paying their respects.
Viewers are watching the land locations for these gun salutes, but Jonathan Beale, this is also happening at sea.
It is, and two warships, HMS Diamond, which left Portsmouth yesterday, doing it out on the south coast. Also HMS Montrose, which I think is at the moment in port in Duqm in Oman, taking part in this salute. You know, the Navy, no doubt about it, has a special place in the heart of the royal family. But you know, you've got to remember that the Duke of Edinburgh passed his love of the Navy down to his sons, both to the Prince of Wales and to Prince Andrew.
Number one gun! Fire! What's the call, sir? Number two, load. Numbers 1 and 2, cartridge only, allied! Number 1, make safe! Number 1, cartridge only, unload! One and two! Moving! Detachments! Rear! Detachments! Rear! Detachment! Up! Detachment! Up! Detachment! Up! First City of London Battery, Honourable Artillery Company.
Well, that brings to an end the 41-gun death salute for the Duke of Edinburgh. And Jonathan Beale, who is our defence correspondent with me in the studio. Jonathan, that is really the fullest military tribute that you can imagine.
It is. You know, as we said, a 41-gun salute is pretty rare. It's normally a 21-gun salute. And then to coordinate it right across the UK in the major cities, but also in Portsmouth, in Devonport, in Gibraltar, on board Royal Navy warships as well, I think just shows you how important the Duke of Edinburgh was to the military, what special place he holds in their hearts, as well as when he was alive, this place he held them in. And I think that this is the tribute, or the start of the tribute, that they want to pay to the extraordinary life of the Duke of Edinburgh, who himself was one of theirs, was somebody who served, saw combat, and had a military connection right up until the very end. You know, remember, he was rescued by a Royal Navy warship when he was just 18 months old from Greece, HMS Calypso. He was there during the Second World War saw action, mentioned in dispatches, and then was there at the very end when the Japanese signed the surrender on a British warship. And he kept that association, not just with the Royal Navy, but with the Army, the Air Force as well, holding honorary ranks and also regularly turning up. And you could see that he was a man who connected with the troops. You know, even in his last appearance last year, when he handed over the Colonel-in-Chief role of the Rifles to Camilla, he wanted to speak to the troops. He wanted to engage with them. And you know, they loved him.
So this was a means of honouring one of their own. And we should also just keep reminding viewers that this was an extraordinary display of coordination and synchronicity, because those guns were all being fired at the same time in all those locations.
Yeah, and different guns. So you know, we talked about in Woolwich Barracks and using the guns from the First World War, the 13-pounder field guns, but they were also using 105mm light guns at the other locations like Cardiff, Edinburgh, Belfast, Tower of London, and then the Royal Navy using their ceremonial guns too, both on the dockside at Portsmouth and Devonport, but also on those ships at sea at present. Of course, the Royal Navy is much smaller now than it used to be when the Duke of Edinburgh was serving as a young officer. But you know, the traditions remain the same, and also the attachments are still as strong as ever.
We don't have those pictures of the salute at sea, but hopefully they will come in at some stage, take a little longer to come in, of course. We can just see the individual ceremonies coming to an end, this at Edinburgh Castle. And Jonathan, at an occasion like this, one would normally expect big crowds, of course, but that just can't happen.
Yeah, and there was a very clear message from the Ministry of Defence when they announced this would be taking place, that the public should stay at home and watch it on TV and take part in that way. And of course, you know, it's frustrating, I suspect, for many people that they can't be there, that they can't see this. But, you know, we hope we've given them a sense of the occasion. Being able to see this happening right across the United Kingdom, not just in one place, I think is pretty special.
And if people happen to be in the vicinity, they may well have heard the guns.
I think they may have felt the vibrations too. But yes, I mean, as John Maguire was saying down in Portsmouth, he was feeling it. So, yeah, a sombre occasion, but, you know, those noises break through the silence.
Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. That was our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale. Well, while we're watching the end of this ceremony, millions of young people around the world have taken part in the Duke of Edinburgh's award. Prince Philip launched the scheme in 1956, once describing it as a do-it-yourself growing up kit. Well, joining me now is John Watts, who is a chef in St Albans, and he was the first person to achieve bronze, silver and gold in the Duke of Edinburgh award while he was in prison. John, hello there. Welcome to BBC News, and thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit more about how important it was for you to participate in this scheme.
It was incredibly important. I mean, at 18 years old, so 12 years ago, I was a little boy in prison with no future. Taking part in the Duke of Edinburgh's Awards gave me so many things, but amongst other things, it gave me a skill. I learned how to cook, and now I'm a chef. I like to think I have a fairly successful career, but more than that, I have a passion in life. You know, I'm very passionate about what I do. There's a fire that burns in my belly, and you know, I'm able to lead a good life away from a life that I was living and away from a life that I could have been living had it gone the other way.
You speak with such sincerity and enthusiasm. Was this something that you volunteered to do, or were you just expected to do it?
Yeah, no, it was. I volunteered to do it, but it was just to get me out of my cell, to be honest, because you're locked up for a long time. So I just registered to do it to do something different. I didn't think that it would be something that would change my life. I didn't think that learning to cook would be something that I would go on to do and become so passionate about. It was just about doing something at the time, and it's just led on to be something really quite amazing.
So you achieved bronze, silver and gold, and then you were awarded your gold award, I assume, by the Duke himself. Tell us about that.
I was, yes. So I had the pleasure of being in the palace 10 years ago this month, actually. And I met the Duke and I was awarded my gold award certificate. And I got to speak to him and he asked me about my expedition. And I told him that we had been released on day release to go into the Brecon Beacons. And he asked me if we were all attached by ball and chain. So I think when you meet someone like Prince Philip, it can be quite overwhelming. So for him to sort of break the ice with a little, a fun comment like that, it sort of helps and eases you into it. And it was a really incredible experience to meet him. And I was lucky enough to meet him 3 times, actually.
3 times? What were the other occasions?
Duke of Edinburgh's awards event, like a charity event, and 2 events. So 2 charity events for the Duke of Edinburgh's awards.
Mm. And as a personality, you were clearly well up to that sort of combative, sharp wit that he had.
Yeah, I just think, he's a historical figure. So it's just amazing to be able to experience, meeting him and, being a part of his legacy in what I do now as well.
And how is your life now, John?
It's fun. I mean, COVID has obviously thrown a lot of challenges my way, but I think taking part in the Duke of Edinburgh's award has built me up towards that. I can take on these challenges head on because I know that, you're going to go through tough times and that, it builds character, if anything. So, I'm coping very well given the circumstances.
And that's what the award is all about, isn't it? It's about self-reliance and resilience and being active.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And it's just given me so much in my life now. I owe Prince Philip and I owe the Duke of Edinburgh's award a lot.
OK, well, that's very good to hear and it's very good to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's John Watts, who's a chef in St Albans. Thank you. Now, we have just received these pictures of part of the gun salute being fired to Prince Philip. This is from on board the HMS Diamond at sea. Well, our reporter John Maguire is in Portsmouth for us, where one of the gun salutes was taking place. And John, all quiet there now, but very different when the gun salutes were taking place. You said it was extremely loud.
It was, Rita, every time the guns fired here. And remember, from those pictures you just saw, and indeed on board HMS Diamond just now, we're talking about much smaller guns, ceremonial guns, certainly smaller than the ones we saw being fired at Edinburgh Castle and at Woolwich Barracks and at the Tower of London, for example. So a 3-pound shell, but it still made a very, very loud explosion, shook the ground. We all were standing around 30 metres away and had to wear double levels of ear protection, actually. And the first round that was fired really made people jump out of their skin. I think what struck me about the whole process, watching not only what was happening here, but also the pictures from right around the UK and indeed from Gibraltar as well, was the sort of the military precision, but also the metronomic sense of a round being fired, of the guns being fired in that 41 gun salute every single minute, almost like a slow tolling bell at a funeral, really. And it really set the tone here. Of course, was no public gathered anywhere, although I saw some people obviously gathering to a certain extent in some of the more public areas. But we're in a naval base here, so restricted Ministry of Defence property, although having said that, there were ferries going across the water. The Isle of Wight ferry was going across, also the Gosport ferry heading across to the other side of the water here, where the gunnery team actually are normally based. There were 2 people on each gun and also people standing behind them, making sure the timing was absolutely precision perfect to the second, counting the rounds being fired, and of course commanding them, making sure that nothing went untoward with the guns. It's worth pointing out, I think, just behind me, the new Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers here that are based at Portsmouth, at the naval base. HMS Queen Elizabeth closest to us, and then HMS Prince of Wales you might be able to see just off in the distance there. Obviously, Portsmouth still very much the largest naval base in the UK, the home of the Navy, and somewhere that Prince Philip would have been extremely familiar with. And just talking to serving and former naval officers and non-commissioned officers this morning, all very much in mind of saying they wanted to salute the Duke of Edinburgh for his years of service, not only royal service, but also his military service too.
John, thank you very much. Our correspondent, John Maguire there. Well, let us now remember some of the lasting words and images of the life and times of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Gun salutes have taken place to mark the death of the Duke of Edinburgh at the age of 99. They took place across the United Kingdom to mark an extraordinary life of duty and service. Prince Philip was by the Queen's side for more than 70 years. The royal family is mourning the loss of a beloved husband and father.
If you were having problems, you could always go to him and know that he would listen and try to help.
I think he'd probably want to be remembered as, as an individual in his own right, really.
The Earl and Countess of Wessex visited Windsor Castle this morning. Details about the Duke's funeral are due to be released later today, as tributes are paid here in Windsor, across the country and around the world. Prince Philip will be remembered as one of the first people in the public eye to champion the cause of conservation. And will be reflecting on his love of sport. Hello, good afternoon, and a warm welcome to the BBC's News at 1 here at Windsor Castle. Gun salutes have taken place to mark the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. They were held across the UK, in Gibraltar, and from Navy warships at sea. At midday, batteries fired 41 rounds, one every minute. Prince Philip, who died yesterday at the age of 99, served as a naval officer during the Second World War and held the office of Lord High Admiral. Later today, details of the Duke's funeral are expected to be announced. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell has this report.
At midday, in the capital cities of the four nations of the United Kingdom, 41 gun salutes were fired. And for a man who served in the Royal Navy in the Second World War and later, guns were fired in the Royal Naval Base in Portsmouth and in Gibraltar, home to the Royal Navy's Gibraltar Squadron. At Windsor Castle, Prince Edward arrived to join the Queen in the family's mourning as officials put the finishing touches to the plans for the Duke's funeral. And from the family, in a BBC programme broadcast last night, personal tributes from three of the Duke's children.
His energy was astonishing in supporting my mama and doing it for such a long time, and in some extraordinary way, being able to go on doing it for so long.
His appreciation of how he could help the Queen always seemed to be present in terms of supporting her, because she was very young when she became Queen, and it needed to be, I think, a double act for a lot of that time in order to allow her to take on that role.
My father was always a great source of support and encouragement. It was and guidance all the way through, and never trying to curtail any of the activities or anything that we wanted to try and do, but always encourage that. And always remember and thank him for that.
Well, you know, he didn't suffer fools gladly, and so you had to. So if you said anything, you know, that was in any way ambiguous, he'd say, "Well, make up your mind," you know. So perhaps it made one choose your words carefully, if you know what I mean. He was very good at showing you how to do things and instruct you in various things.
I think I will best remember him as always being there and a person you could bounce off ideas. But if you were having problems, you could always go to him and know that he would listen and try to help.
What he's done has amounted to an astonishing achievement, I think.
The Duke's funeral is expected to take place at St George's Chapel inside Windsor Castle, the setting so often for royal weddings, but in a week's time it will be where the Queen and the Duke's immediate family say their final farewells. The service will be in strict compliance with COVID regulations. From Windsor Castle, a short time ago, the Earl and Countess of Wessex departed after seeing the Queen. She, the Countess, said, is being amazing.
And our royal correspondent Sarah Campbell has been with me throughout the day here at Windsor Castle. And what more might we expect over the course of the day, Sarah?
Well, of course, it's now just over 24 hours since the announcement was made that the Duke of Edinburgh had passed away here at Windsor Castle. And over the coming days, this really is where the focus will continue to be. Due to the pandemic, of course, people are being asked not to gather at royal residences. But look around here. I mean, clearly people are. People are feeling compelled to come and share tributes, share messages. We've spoken to some of them to just find out why they wanted to come.
Very difficult to find men like him, who has been very supportive to his wife
all throughout his life, gave up his career for her.
He was just a great man, wasn't he? A great servant to the country.
We respect everything that the Duke of Edinburgh has done for, well, the Queen and for us as a country. And we just want to show our support to the royal family, really.
So the flowers that were left outside Cambridge Gate yesterday were all taken inside the grounds of Windsor Castle yesterday evening, and my understanding is the same thing will happen again this evening. There is an online book of condolence which is now live on the royal website, and the hope is that people, rather than travelling and leaving messages physically, they will leave those messages of support on that online website. Now, of course, we all know that over the past year, COVID has affected the ability of all families to properly mourn their lost loved ones, and Prince Philip is going to be no exception, and we are waiting to hear the details of his funeral, which are due to be approved by the Queen and which we expect to be made public this afternoon. Clearly, any thoughts of a large-scale funeral procession at which crowds would want to come and be a part of simply won't happen due to the COVID pandemic, and we expect further details, as I say, this afternoon.
All right, Sarah, thank you very much for now. Sarah Campbell, our royal correspondent. Well, tributes to the Duke of Edinburgh have continued to pour in from around the world. As Australians woke on Saturday to the news of Prince Philip's death, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison said his life had been one of duty, service, loyalty and honour. Our Sydney correspondent, Shaima Khalil, sent this report.
Honouring a life of duty and service. A sign of respect for a man who for decades has had a long and enduring relationship with this country. The Prime Minister paid tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh, whose presence, he said, was a reminder of the stability needed in a world that can often be uncertain.
Memories of him will, of course, tell stories of his candour and a unique and forceful and authentic personality. But above all, he was a man who was steadfast, who could be relied upon, always standing by his Queen.
Prince Philip's military services first brought him here in 1940. But it was in 1954 that he arrived alongside the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth on an historic visit, the first by a reigning monarch to Australia.
Troops and representatives of many Australasian lands.
The Duke visited more than 20 times and has fostered a close connection with the country and its people. At times, taking a moment to enjoy the famed Aussie lifestyle.
Throughout the decades, Prince Philip was patron to nearly 50 organizations here, but it's his character, his candor, his ability to be himself that have endeared him to so many Australians.
More than 700,000 young Australians have taken part in the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. Sarah Yolko started when she was 16.
I don't think I would have been able to actually participate in community events or participate in physical activity and learn these new skills that I got to learn without the award kind of pushing me to do that.
The Duke of Edinburgh has always been warmly welcomed here, and he'll be fondly remembered by the politicians and the public alike.
Well, we stay with reaction from around the world. It was at the Treetops Hotel in Kenya that Prince Philip and then Princess Elizabeth were when she became Queen on the night that King George VI died. At Treetops now is our Africa correspondent, Catherine Biarunga. Catherine.
Hi, good afternoon, Jane. And I'm speaking to you from the Aberdares in Kenya. And this region is often described as the Scotland of Kenya. And as you can see, it's just about to start pouring down with rain. But it was here in 1952 that the then Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip came to visit Treetops, which is just actually on the other side of this watering hole behind me. It was here on that night that they spent at the treehouse here that she became Queen. Queen. And Prince Philip was actually the one who had to break the news to her that her beloved father, who had been ill for a long time, had actually died, and that she had now become the monarch. Now, this was an event that transformed both their lives, including Prince Philip, because he now had to take on a role supporting his wife. And over the decades, we've seen him making a significant impact on the continent. And we've had some of the leaders in this region speaking out after his death. The president of Kenya described him as a symbol for family values and a global unifying force. And right now today, there are thousands of young people who have been impacted by the work that was done through the Duke of Edinburgh International Award. And today there are around 400,000 young people who are carrying out various activities, from entrepreneurship to community work. And one thing that was very important to him was giving people the skills they needed to be able to create jobs. Now, this is a very important thing on the continent because we have high youth unemployment rates. So a lot of people today are saying that this is probably going to be one of the biggest impacts that he's had in this region through the Duke of Edinburgh International Award.
Catherine, many thanks. Catherine Biarunga in Kenya. Well, Prince Philip will be remembered as one of the first people in the public eye to champion the cause of conservation. For nearly 20 years, he was president of the World Wildlife Fund, which is now the Worldwide Fund for Nature. And after stepping down from that role, he remained an active campaigner, as our science and environment editor David Shookman reports.
Nature was one of Prince Philip's great loves, and the need to conserve it became a lifelong passion. He fought not just for endangered species, but for the whole of the natural world.
We depend on being part of the web of life. We depend on every other living thing on this planet, just as much as they depend on us.
From his earliest official visits around the globe, this one to Antarctica, wildlife was always a theme. He used his position to inspire younger generations. In this lecture for 2,000 children, many of the pictures were his.
I don't think I'll tell you which are mine, but if you ever see a very bad one, you'll know.
An emerging theme was our responsibility.
If we as humans have got this power of life and death, not just life and death, but extinction and survival of other species of life, then we ought to exercise it with some sort of moral sense. I mean, why make something extinct if we don't have to?
He authored or contributed to a series of dramatically titled books about threats to nature. And he took advantage of his access to governments the world over. He helped to set up the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and he led it for years. On a visit to the pandas in China, he highlighted the need to save them and their habitats. And he went live on television with David Attenborough to make that point.
The panda range has been squeezed between mountains on one side and human encroachment on the other.
His importance to conservation worldwide has been absolutely huge. You can go anywhere in the world, and he will know where you have to make the connection, where you have to put the pressure, what you have to do. And he's very practical in those terms.
But he didn't always help himself.
There was the tiger.
In the 60s, he joined tiger hunts, and he once shot a tiger in India. This image was to remain controversial. It was later said that tigers weren't considered endangered back then. But Prince Philip did have his own distinct views. He supported fox hunting and the shooting of game birds, which set him at odds with many environmentalists.
There is an advantage in people wanting to shoot, because if you have a game species, you want it to survive because you want to have some more next year. It's exactly like a farmer. You want to crop it. You don't want to exterminate it.
So this was a man with his own brand of environmental concern. And he did not like being labelled.
Would you describe yourself as a green? As green?
No.
Why not?
Well, because I think that there's a difference between being concerned for the conservation of nature and being a bunny hugger. When I was president of WWF, I got more letters about people, the way animals were treated in zoos, than about any concern for the survival of a species. But people can't get their heads around the idea of a species surviving.
And as far back as 1970, with a young Prince Charles by his side, he was typically forthright about the need to be realistic in the fight for nature.
After all, even naturalists drive cars occasionally. And having accepted that, we must go a step further and recognize that compromises have to be reached. Disagreement is inevitable, but the groups must go on meeting, because we have simply got to hammer out answers to problems which are going to affect all life in these islands for generations to come.
In many ways, Prince Philip was ahead of his time, using his fame as a royal to raise awareness of conservation. An early environmentalist who did not want to be called that, a unique campaigner for a cause that's ever more relevant.
Well, we will reflect further in just a moment on the Duke of Edinburgh's life, but for now, just take a brief look as well at some of the day's other main news. And 2 men are appearing in court in Belfast, charged with rioting after a further night of violence in Northern Ireland. Police were pelted with stones, bottles and petrol bombs. Loyalist groups had urged their supporters to stay at home following the death of Prince Philip. A friend of David Cameron has said the former Prime Minister now believes he should have put his request for funding for Greensill Capital in writing. Mr Cameron texted the Chancellor Rishi Sunak last year in an attempt to help the now collapsed financial firm get access to coronavirus loans. His friend has insisted, though, that no rules have been broken. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro has accused a Supreme Court judge in the country of judicial activism after he ordered an inquiry into the country's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Mr Bolsonaro's response to COVID has been criticised as shambolic because of his opposition to lockdowns, mask wearing and vaccines. Now let's return to our coverage of the life of the Duke of Edinburgh, and his sporting activities provided him with a welcome opportunity to get away from formal royal duties. For him, sport became an outlet for his restless energy, and Prince Philip proved himself a keen and talented competitor in a number of sports. Our correspondent Natalie Perks looks back at the Duke's sporting life.
Prince Philip always enjoyed sport, and he often excelled at it. At school, he learned to love sailing. As a wedding present, he and the Queen were given a yacht. The Duke took part in the Royal Regatta at Cowes for 50 years, even winning the most prestigious trophy, the Britannia Cup, with his friend Uffa Fox in 1952.
The thing about going to sea is you're suddenly exposed to an element which you can't really control. You're subject to it, and I think that's quite good for the soul, frankly.
And now a change of bowling from the pavilion end.
As an enthusiastic cricketer, he also drew praise from high places.
And that one moved across the leg.
He has a perfect action for a right-hand off-spin bowler.
But what you might not know is just how the playing fields around us are a huge part of his legacy. While councils were busy selling them off, his tireless fundraising campaign led to thousands of UK sites being saved.
It's a true testament to his passion and commitment to sport and the opportunities that he saw that sport could create for so many young people who didn't necessarily have access to green space.
The Duke shared the Queen's love of horses and became one of the top 4 polo players in Britain in the mid-60s, cementing the sport as a firm royal favourite. Arthritis ended his playing career at 50.
Go on, you stupid hole! Get on!
But carriage driving became his new passion, and he was instrumental in drawing up the rules. He helped raise its profile and competed for Britain at World and European Championships.
Great Britain was represented by George Bowman.
Fellow teammate George Bowman remembered him fondly.
I was a scrap merchant. And of course, he was a prince. And at times people made a lot about this. But he never treated me
any different. He always looked at me like an equal. And that was one of the things I really admired about him.
Despite some hair-raising spills along the way, the Duke carried on well into old age. His passion made sport a family affair.
And that report from our sports correspondent, Natalie Perks. Hello, a very good afternoon to you from Windsor Castle. I'm Jane Hill. If you are just joining us, we are continuing with BBC News special coverage throughout the afternoon here. Gun salutes have been fired across the UK, in Gibraltar as well, and from warships at sea to pay tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh. Details of the Duke's funeral are expected to be announced a little later today. Prince Philip was, of course, the longest-serving royal consort in British history. He was a constant support to the Queen during more than 70 years of marriage. Senior church figures have been paying tribute to him for his service as consort to a Christian monarch and with his own faith a central part of his life. I've been speaking to a former chaplain to the Queen, Dr. Gavin Ashenden, about this aspect of the Duke's life. And he began, in fact, by explaining his own family's personal connection with the Duke.
My father and Prince Philip were both officers together on the same ship in the North Sea convoys. And so that was a fairly important time for obviously for them both. And my dad remembered the collegiality of those years very fondly, and used to give me messages to send to Prince Philip when I was at the palace or at the Windsor Castle from time to time.
Did he? What were some of his remembrances? How did he remember him? Because of course so many people talk about what a very high-flying career Prince Philip could have gone on to have had that been something that was open to him.
Yes, well, he was an immensely competent officer, and those experiences in the North Sea convoys were really quite terrifying. My father wrote about them in private memoirs, and I was just astonished at what men of... So my dad and Prince Philip were exactly the same age, and what they went through together was really hard to imagine for those of us who haven't had to go through them. Dad thought that Prince Philip was just an excellent officer and a very good friend, and a marvellous man, and one he admired and liked very much.
And as we say, you were, of course, you are a former chaplain to Her Majesty the Queen, and we know that her personal Christian faith is of enormous importance to her. In your experience, was it equally important to the Duke of Edinburgh?
Yes, it was. I think, although expressed more privately, I mean, he was, as you've heard a lot of people say, a very private person in lots of ways. I mean, not many people know that the two most important women in his life were profoundly influenced by the Christian faith. So his mother became a Greek Orthodox nun at the end of her life. She gave away all her belongings. Albeit quite an eccentric one. She chain-smoked and played canasta. There weren't many nuns like her. But she also harbored Jewish refugees in her own flat during the war, risking her own liberty. And so she was, of course, an enormously important influence. And then his wife has showed the greatest possible Christian fortitude and example, and really been the most wonderful ambassador for Christianity, for authentic Christianity, in a period of time when the church has begun to lose some of its influence and grip on the popular imagination due to a whole series of factors. But Prince Philip and the Queen have been at the forefront of being part of the glue that's held together the really important values of Christian civilization, which I think we're going to miss as they become increasingly eroded.
Former chaplain to the Queen, Dr. Gavin Ashenden there, speaking to me just a little earlier here on BBC News about the importance of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh's Christian faith, and talking about his own family connections as well. Well, as we were saying, at midday today, gun salutes were fired across the UK, in Gibraltar, and from warships at sea to pay tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh. Let's take a moment to discuss the importance and the symbolism, really, of a gun salute. I'm joined by Lieutenant Colonel David Luck, who is from the ceremonial events team at the Ministry of Defence. Thank you for joining us. Talk us through, in layman's terms, if that's possible, what that essentially means, why it stands out as a mark of tribute.
Good afternoon, Jane. Well, essentially, a gun salute is an honour. It is a salute, as it says, and it's the way in which traditionally it has become the mark of respect from the armed forces on these tremendous important occasions. And so it is therefore the best possible way that we know within the resources that we have to mark such occasions. And in this case, of course, the sad passing away of His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. And it's with mixed emotions, I think, because none of us would ever want to have to perform these duties, but we all know that at some stage or another we might have to do so. And so it's an honour and a privilege for all members of the armed forces, and particularly for my own regiment, the Royal Regiment of Artillery, of course, is charged with performing these duties on occasions such as these.
And the Duke, as we have reflected, of course, had a very distinguished naval career in his younger days, and that connection with the armed forces generally is there throughout his life, as it is for so many members of the royal family.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the Duke was an enthusiastic and very much engaged supporter of the armed forces, of all branches of the armed forces. And the fact that, his own career was in the Royal Navy, he still had a massive amount of interest in both the Royal Air Force and my own armed force, the Army, and indeed was colonel of many regiments, and took a great interest, not just in what was going on with each one of those, but very much in terms of what was going on with the people in those organisations. And he was, as you would expect, I suspect from a former serving naval officer, he was very at ease when talking to soldiers, sailors and airmen. And he had a tremendous knack of being able to bring out the best in them.
And that's really interesting, because that's a reflection that so many people have made that I've spoken to today, no matter who he was talking to, from whatever field of life, whatever field of industry. He was engaged and had always had lots and lots to say to them. Probably had lots of opinions as well. But that is coming out time and again. And you're saying that that's absolutely true in your case.
Very much so. I think a piece on your programme yesterday brought out that he had an extraordinarily curious intellect, and there's no doubt about that, because even if he hadn't been involved or directly involved or experienced what you were doing, he always wanted to know what it was you were doing, how you were doing it, and what impact that had on you and your fellow soldiers, sailors and airmen, how you worked together as a team to effectively come together and achieve your aim. And he was very, very well briefed, but he was also very, very widely read, and he knew so much about the armed forces, and that came through very, very clearly in the support that he had for the armed forces. And of course, it was his final parade when he relinquished the rank of Captain General of the Royal Marines. And I was speaking, funnily enough, to a friend of mine earlier who was on that parade, and he said to me, it was extraordinary. It was when he looked you directly in the eye and talked to you about your experiences and what you'd done, that you realised just how much interest he had in what you'd been up to, and also just how much faith he had in you to do the job that you had, because of course he'd been there himself, and he had done so, and he'd been through the training, and of course he'd been on operations. And that was a very good feeling to have when you met him, because he'd been there, he'd done it.
Absolutely. I mean, would he have ever said or reflected that he would have liked to stay longer with his naval career? We know the reasons for which it wasn't possible, but is that something he would have ever commented on in a private conversation with someone?
I very much doubt it, to be perfectly honest. As we've already heard, His Royal Highness was a very private man, and I think those things would have affected him personally, certainly from a career perspective, would have been his own musings, and he wouldn't have widely shared them. But there was no doubt about it that he absolutely loved the armed forces. Obviously, a particular affection for his own Royal Navy, reflected absolutely appropriately by the fact that he was the Lord High Admiral. But whatever we did, whether it was dark blue, light blue or brown, he was with us, and he always showed that real deep care, I think is not too strong a word, about what the officers and soldiers in his regiments and in his ships and or the ships and aircraft establishments, etc., that he had an interest in, what they were up to and how they were doing it.
Very interesting to hear your reflections. Thank you very much. Lieutenant Colonel David Luck from the ceremonial events team at the Ministry of Defence. We've talked a lot about the armed forces. Doubtless we will again a little bit later on. We've also reflected a lot today about the Commonwealth, just how important that role as head of the Commonwealth is to the Queen, to the Duke of Edinburgh. And I'm pleased to say now that I'm joined by Baroness Scotland, Patricia Scotland, of course, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. Very good to have you with us here on BBC News. Thank you so much. Now, I am assuming, Baroness Scotland, that you have had many interactions with the Duke of Edinburgh, given your role. Perhaps you can explain that and talk about what personal recollections you have today.
Well, of course, as you know, the Commonwealth is 54 countries, it's 2.4 billion people, 60% of whom are under the age of 30. And His Royal Highness was absolutely dedicated to all of those 54 countries, and particularly to those 60% of the Commonwealth who was under the age of 30. His devotion to Her Majesty was always clear, but also his devotion to the future and making sure that there was a good future for the young people. And you see that particularly poignantly in the dedicated work that he undertook in relation to those young people through the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. If you remember, when this was created, it was extraordinarily new and avant-garde, to have a member of the royal family invest so directly and so personally into the future of young people, many of whom were very, very disadvantaged, many of whom had never had an opportunity to have this sort of experience. And so I saw from firsthand not only the interest that he took in those individuals, but also the joy that he took from their success. And I was the Dominican representative on the ex-service, Commonwealth ex-service Men and Women's League that, of course, he has championed all the way through. And his eye to detail about the welfare issues was really inspiring. I mean, if he joined a charity, he didn't just join it in name, he joined it with all that was within him. And I don't think His Royal Highness, and the same is actually true to the Queen, ever forgot the service of the Commonwealth volunteers, because all of those who came to the aid of the United Kingdom from the Commonwealth did so as volunteers. None of them were conscripted. And I don't think that relationship, that bond of comradeship was ever broken. And he demonstrated the importance of the Commonwealth coming together as a force for good in the world. And I think every time I saw him, I would marvel at his sense of humour, his wit, and the fact that he quite often had this little mischievous glint in his eye, but he was utterly serious about what mattered in the world, utterly serious about making sure that everybody had a chance and everybody had an opportunity to develop their skills. And I think you saw that in the Commonwealth Studies Conference, and you also saw it in the work he did for the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. Quite remarkable. And I think the
yes,
sadness
and that's so interesting that you reflect that I'm sorry if I'm interrupting you. There's difficulties of our links here, but it's interesting that you say that, because you are by no means the first person I've spoken to today who's talked about that glint in the eye, but along with the seriousness. So it's really striking that keeps coming through time and again as a theme. And he visited, I think I'm right in saying, almost all the Commonwealth countries, almost all of them, and that was the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh took that very seriously.
Absolutely. And if you think about the love that they showed to those countries, Malta, Commonwealth country, was particularly special to them, but the prince's devotion to the environment took him far and wide. He was the one who went to the regions, the Pacific, the small islands in the Pacific. He has been beating the drum for more than 60 years about climate change and that climate crisis, which we all appreciate today. His Royal Highness was talking about on the television as an innovator, more than 50 years ago. And that legacy that he started on environment has been handed over to Prince Charles, who has so committed himself to that, but you're seeing it in the next generation as well. So this love of country, this love of the environment, this love of the Commonwealth, and this love of equality, because the Prince went to all our member states in Africa, in Asia, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific. And what people always remember is his care and attention to detail, his humanity, his support of everything the Queen did. When the Queen spoke about the Commonwealth when she was 21, she said she was going to devote her life to the Commonwealth, whether it was going to be long or short. And from the moment that His Royal Highness joined her as her spouse and then her consort, he was right beside her, absolutely supporting her in her devotion to the Commonwealth. And you'll remember that wasn't always the flavour of the month in terms of Commonwealth, but it's always been the flavour of the day for Her Majesty the Queen and for His Royal Highness. And I don't think there is one day when they forgot the interests of the 2.4 billion people in the Commonwealth who have voluntarily come together in order to make this world a better place. And I think that's what we will remember of him in the Commonwealth, that he was determined to make our Commonwealth a better place for the common good, and that all of us would come together, giving our skills, our talents, and our ability freely, in a free association of member states, to commit ourselves to delivering the things that mattered. And the Commonwealth was the one who came up with the Commonwealth Charter, which pre-configured the Sustainable Development Goals. We did it in 2013. The rest of the world did it in 2015. And it was the Commonwealth who came up with the formula that actually ended up being adopted at the Paris COP21. And so all of that, if you look at his contribution over 70 years, he never gave up, and he was resilient and committed. And I can only imagine how devastated the whole of the royal family must be, because I think we are all devastated too.
Baroness Scotland, many thanks for your thoughts and recollections. Baroness Scotland, Patricia Scotland, Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, of course. Let's stay very much here at Windsor Castle with reflections, with people who knew the Duke of Edinburgh. With me here in the drizzle at the castle, welcome, is Dr. David Staples, who is the Chief Executive of the United Grand Lodge of England.
Thank you very much for having me.
And, well, we are talking, of course, about Freemasons, and I think a lot of people who are watching might not know that the Duke of Edinburgh had any connection, but you can explain it.
He was indeed. I think the first thing to say is that certainly as a younger man, he had an enormous amount of fun with his Freemasonry. He was brought into the Navy Lodge in 1952 by his father-in-law, King George VI. And of course, it's a great thing about our organisation that you don't care if you're a king or a duke or even the son of a forklift truck driver like me. You can come in, you have an enormous amount of fun, and it teaches you to be a better person. And if we think about what he would have actually been doing within that lodge, he went through exactly the same ceremonies that I went through and that other Freemasons the world over have gone through. The first one teaches you the importance of how to respect other people, how it's important to think on those who are less fortunate than yourselves and to bear them in mind. And when we think about the work that he did for charity and the hundreds of organisations that he himself supported actively, I think there's a wonderful synergy there. And the second degree ceremony teaches you the importance of improving yourself through education. And you look at his Duke of Edinburgh's awards and the tens of thousands of young people who have been buoyed up by that, who've gained in self-confidence by that, who have grown into bigger, better people by that. It's again, an enormous synergy between the values that were so clear to him and so important to us.
And is it something that he came to because he actively sought that out? It's something he wanted to join? Is it something that came from his time in the Navy? Where did that inclination to be part of that come from, do you think?
I imagine his father-in-law tapped him on the shoulder and said, this is something that you should be doing. It's a good thing to do. And the final lesson that you learn in Freemasonry, which I think is very pertinent indeed, make the most of your one life. That we have a wonderful phrase in our ceremonies, which is live respected and die regretted. And I think anybody that knew him would realise that he certainly managed that.
And what a wonderfully long life, 99 years, richly lived. Are there stories of his time there? I ask that because I've spoken to so many people today who've reflected on his great knowledge and his great interest in things and his great interest in people when he met them, but also a sense of fun, actually, that perhaps didn't always get seen in general public. Are there stories that touch on that?
I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting to note that he went through his 3 degrees, but he never progressed further within our organisation. I think he saw it very much as a release when he was within the lodge room. He was there with friends, he could enjoy himself, he could relax, and I think that's true of anybody.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. All the best to you. Dr. David Staples, CEO of the United Grand Lodge of England. Very many thanks for your time this afternoon. Well, Prince Philip, on occasion, allowed television crews access to the inner workings of royal life to show the public another side of his family. And one of those documentary makers is Robert Hardman. He toured Windsor Castle here with Prince Philip for a series that was made for BBC One, The Queen's Castle. He's also a royal commentator for the Daily Mail and a biographer. I spoke to him a little earlier on today, and he said that the Queen is, of course, at the forefront of everyone's minds today.
First and foremost, our thoughts are with the Queen. Theirs has been the longest royal marriage in history. I mean, we're living through the reign of one of the greats, the longest lived monarch that we've ever had. And as she herself has said, so much, in fact, everything that she's achieved, she's done thanks to having him there as well. He was the longest serving consort in history, and I was lucky enough as a royal correspondent to go all over the world and watch some of these historic state visits. I mean, this is the most widely travelled monarch in history, the first monarch to go to places like Russia and China, behind the old Iron Curtain, all over the world, and wherever she went, he went. And often the Duke would go when the Queen couldn't go. I mean, when she was a young mother, she couldn't go, for example, didn't have the time, and she had young children. She couldn't sail around the world to open the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne. So she sent the Duke. I mean, he's the only member of the royal family to visit the tiniest outcrop of the Commonwealth of the old British Empire, Pitcairn Island. Had one royal visit, that was the Duke of Edinburgh. He's been to Antarctica. I mean, all these places, but it's always been to represent the Queen. And his whole life is, whenever you talk to his staff, they always said, rule number one, duty number one, support the Queen. So whatever he was doing was primarily in support of her. So yes, as you say, she wakes up today, she's missing this titanic figure who's just been part of her life, of the monarchy's life, and of the life of the nation and the Commonwealth. I mean, it's really nice actually today and yesterday just to see these the level of international tributes coming forth, genuine tributes from people really who have all over the world been touched by the umpteen things that that the Duke was responsible for, whether it's the environment or the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. So many Commonwealth charities, the armed forces. His legacy is colossal.
And I do want to ask you, of course, about your personal reflections as someone who spent time with him, and it's so striking to hear people remembering his humour, people for reflecting on the fact that perhaps that cheekiness, the humour, perhaps didn't necessarily always come across in real life, or it came across in ways that we know and get portrayed as gaffes. But I'm interested in how you found him, in essence, working alongside him.
Well, you've certainly had to have done your homework. I mean, here is someone who, to coin the phrase, did not suffer fools gladly. And, occasionally I did find myself asking what he would call a damn fool question. But with good reason. But people talk about they talk about occasionally his brusqueness or his arrogance or whatever. I mean, he was fundamentally, he was a kind man. He would walk into a room, he'd go into a situation, it was a stiff, tense situation with most royal engagements are, and he wanted to break the ice, to make people relax a little, and he did that with humour. And as he himself once said, if you try and break the ice, occasionally you go through it. And from time to time that happened, but most of the time he was, people always, whenever you saw him in a room, you might be in some big royal reception, you just hear in one corner, you'd hear gales of laughter, and you thought, okay, the Duke's over there, because that was his way. And I was lucky enough to spend some time with him in the castle just behind you there, Jane. And after the fire of 1992, it was the Duke who led the restoration. I mean, it was a very difficult period for the monarchy, and this wonderful 1,000-year-old castle, to see it go up in flames was a tragedy. But he took this issue by the scruff of the neck. He led the restoration committee, and he put it back together. And in fact, you can go around a lot of parts of the castle, it's in better condition now than it was then. The estate around you there, the Great Park, he's been the longest serving ranger of the Great Park in its 1,000-year history. And all over Windsor, there are signs of the things he's done, whether it's the restoration of the deer herd you might see over down the Long Wall, that famous Long Wall. Tucked away in the estate where you won't see it is actually a vineyard, which was the Duke's idea a few years ago. He worked out that this soil might be quite good for producing grapes. And lo and behold, Windsor Castle sparkling wine is now so good that the Queen has been serving it at state banquets to world leaders. I mean, the level and the degree of the span of its interest is extraordinary. But I think it's on the global stage for those organisations like the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, the World Wildlife Fund, a pioneering organisation that paved the way for so many other environmental groups to follow. That those sort of things, that's a legacy that we'll be talking about, for many, many years to come.
Robert Hardman, the biographer and author, speaking to me just a couple of hours ago. Well, the Duke of Edinburgh had an obvious personal and close association with Scotland, dating back a long time, of course, back to his school days at Gordonston in the 1930s. He and the Queen have enjoyed holidays with family at Balmoral every autumn for many decades, as Glenn Campbell now reports.
At Holyrood Palace, the lion rampant is lowered, as the city that has long shared its name with the Duke of Edinburgh takes in the news posted on the palace gates that His Royal Highness has died 2 months short of his 100th birthday.
I do feel incredibly sad. I think it would be a great loss, and he was a real character.
The Prince has been around for 99 years and has been at the Queen's side the entire time. So it's a huge loss to the country, especially given his long service.
In Ballater on Royal Deeside, some remember a prince they met in person.
We're walking in Ballacabooey Forest, and this black Range Rover came up, and the Duke got out and was fixing something at the side of the road. He must have been 94.
A character that we can all identify with. Yeah, sad. And I feel so sorry for the dear Queen.
From his school days to big national moments like the opening of the Scottish Parliament, the Duke of Edinburgh's association with Scotland was lifelong. The royal couple were regular attenders of the Highland Games when they summered at Balmoral.
I think Prince Philip loved Aberdeenshire because of the peace and quiet, and indeed the outdoors. A man who was an accomplished sportsman. He loved attending the Braemar Gathering, the Ballater Games. I think he loved the competitive nature of Highland Games.
In Glasgow, more memories and reflections.
Absolutely gutted. I honestly thought that he was going to get to the 100. I think a lot of people actually wished that he was going to get to that 100, and gutted for the Queen.
I did the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, and that is something very positive he's gave to the community.
And from Inverness,
you kind of felt that it was coming, but it was still a bit of a shock at the same time when you heard about it.
Yeah, it was just like a shame you didn't make it to like 100. Like, it was so close to like his 100th, and he was like a pillar of like the royal family and like quite an icon.
more tributes will be paid at Holyrood on Monday when Parliament is recalled to remember a remarkable prince. Glenn Campbell, Edinburgh.
Well, really very busy here at Windsor Castle now. People coming all the time just to be around the castle, some of them bringing flowers, and a very, very busy time here for the last few hours in particular. And we know, of course, that Prince Edward and his wife, Sophie Wessex, arrived a little earlier on today. And Sophie Wessex there just spoke briefly to the many people who were along the road there and just spotted them, saw at the last minute that it was indeed the royal couple, the Duke's youngest son, of course, and his wife. And she said apparently to some of the onlookers there that the Queen is being amazing. Prince Edward there, who came to visit the Queen in the last hour or two. Well, a 2-minute silence will be held later this afternoon, just before the Grand National. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss is at Aintree and told me what would be happening there later this afternoon.
It's really a chance for racing to pay its respects here today at Aintree. Prince Philip was an honorary member of the Jockey Club, and before racing started here yesterday there was a 2-minute silence, and the same will happen again today before racing gets underway at around about 1:30. Again, the course will fall silent. All the flags around the course are at half-mast, and the jockeys are also being invited to wear black armbands. It is already a very subdued atmosphere to what we would normally expect at a Grand National, not least, of course, because there are no spectators here today. For the first time, the Grand National is taking place behind closed doors. And of course, across the sporting world, there will be tributes to Prince Philip here today. There'll be a silence before all the Premier League football matches, also before football matches in Scotland. But here in Aintree, as I say, the Grand National, very much the focus of the sporting world today, and racing will be very keen to pay its respects to Prince Philip before racing gets underway.
Andy Swiss at Aintree for today's Grand National. Well, last November, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh celebrated 73 years of marriage. And over the years, they've both reflected on a unique partnership, which was one of enduring devotion and support.
The fact of the matter is that a marriage involves two partners. When there's lots to do, time seems to fly. And it appears to us, at least, that we've been fairly busy over the last 50 years. And the time has, of course, flashed past. Until, that is, you start looking back and try to recall what things were like 50 years ago. And you begin to realize how much has changed. In the autumn of 1947, we got married. Everyone seemed to think that our wedding was a very happy occasion and brought a little colour back to life after the dreary war years. We certainly thought so. We were then fortunate to enjoy 5 happy years of fairly conventional married life, and that included 2 years with a home of our own in Malta while I was in the Navy. Of course, this period came to an abrupt end when the Queen had the melancholy duty of succeeding her father after his premature death in 1952. She was 25 and I was 30, and we had 2 small children. And life, as you can imagine, changed dramatically in many ways, but it had much less effect on our married life than I anticipated. And then after an interval of 10 hectic years, we had 2 more children and were more or less settled into our new way of life. And like all families, we went through the full range of pleasures and tribulations of bringing up children. Much can be done by an individual, but I'm sufficiently old-fashioned to believe that a great deal more can be achieved by a partnership in marriage.
All too often, I fear Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. Frequently, we have discussed my intended speech beforehand, and as you will imagine, his views have been expressed in a forthright manner.
The main lesson that we've learned is that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It may not be quite so important when things are going well, but it is absolutely vital when things get difficult. And you can take it from me that the Queen has the quality of tolerance and abundance.
He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
Well, we have seen the gun salute that took place across the country and in Gibraltar and from ships at sea at midday. A 41-gun salute to mark the passing of the Duke of Edinburgh, who died yesterday at the age of 99. And the Tower of London, the last of those sites there across the country and from ships at sea and in Gibraltar, the 41-gun salute to mark the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. We will have continuing coverage from here at Windsor Castle throughout the day here on BBC News, of course. But for now, we say goodbye to viewers on BBC One. We will stay with reflections on the life of the Duke on BBC News.